The following presentation is session 2 of a 4-part series of the Beginner Beekeeping Survival Guide. There are 4 different beekeeping associations creating these sessions, and it is our goal to try to impart as much information as possible for beginner beekeepers to give you the tools that you need to become a more successful beekeeper or a successful beekeeper. The session is 2 hours and 40 minutes long and can be very boring at times, but it's got a lot of information that's really, really vital to a new beekeeper. My name is Dr. Leonard Davis. I am an Eastern Agricultural Society Master Beekeeper, also president of Bullitt County Beekeeping Association. And working with, like I said, 3 other beekeeping associations in producing these videos. Again, we hope to impart good information for you, and I hope you will be able to utilize the information to become a very, very good beekeeper and really enjoy your beekeeping and your bees. So this is the Beekeeping Survival Guide, Session 2, and I'm going to talk to you today about the various different honeybee species across the world. There are approximately 11 different species and 44 subspecies. This honeybee is Apis dorsata, which is also known as the wild giant honeybee of Nepal, Malaysia, Singapore, and India. A very large honeybee. They make their nests on the outside of rock crevices and rock cliffs, and also very large tree limbs. And the honey is, in fact, harvested by people over in that area. They have tried to put these bees inside of hives, man-made hives, but they will not stay in the hives. This is Apis florea, another honeybee known as a wild dwarf honeybee of southern and southeastern Asia. They also make their hives on the outside of against the tree limbs and in various locations. This honey is also harvested at times by people. This is Apis cerana. This actually is the eastern honeybee found in Asia, which is the bee that beekeepers keep in that part of the country. And then we're going to talk about Apis mellifera, which is the European or Western honeybee, which is in fact the honeybee that we keep in this country, the United States, and other parts of the world, Europe and Asia. There are various subspecies, Apis mellifera ligustica, which are the Italians, Carnica, the Carniolans, Caucasica, Caucasians, Mellifera mellifera, German black bee, and of course Mellifera scutellata, which is the African bee. And there are various hybrids and other selected strains that over the years, like for example, Brother Adam, Buckfast Abbey, had the Buckfast bees. And he spent literally his entire life trying to produce a bee that was resistant to varroa mites and resistant and also not a common swarming type bee, a very gentle bee actually. And the varroa sensitive hygienic or VSH bees, the Minnesota hygienic, these are bees that are bred to be more resistant to varroa mites. This is a picture of a grocery store produced by Whole Foods, and they are on board with protecting honeybees. This shows in the top picture your choices of produce with bees, and then the bottom picture your choices without bees. Honeybees really are responsible for the pollination of fruits and vegetables and many plants that we eat. And about one out of every 3 bites of food you take actually comes directly from the pollination of honeybees. Here it just shows a honeybee maybe possibly on a zucchini or a squash plant. Here's one, I believe this might be an apple blossom or possibly almond blossom. This is actually a semi that is full of honeybee hives. And I would say approximately 90% of beehives in this country are owned by 10% of beekeepers because they're very large commercial beekeepers. And the main reason they keep honeybees actually is not necessarily for honey per se, but for pollination purposes. That is the main use of honeybees in this country is pollination purposes, pollination of plants for fruits and vegetables. And they'll transport these bees across the country, going to various locations to pollinate plants. This is actually a picture of almond trees in California. There are approximately 2 million acres of almond trees in California, and they actually require honeybees to pollinate those flowers in order to produce the almonds. And so, therefore, the beehives have to be placed within these almond fields and to pollinate the flowers. And there's approximately 1.6 million beehives are transported to California every year in February for about 2 weeks. They leave them out there to pollinate these trees. There's approximately probably 400,000 to 600,000 beehives in California, but they actually move 1.6 million beehives to California from various parts of this country, mostly from the southern United States, like Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and so forth, and Louisiana, and they move them up there every February. It's a really amazing situation. So now we're going to talk about beehives and purchasing types of your beehives you may have to purchase. The most common beehive that people use actually is called Langstroth versus top bar and Moray hive. And we'll discuss those here. This is just a picture of a Langstroth beehive, and there's actually two deep bodies, we call them, and those are generally used for what's called the brood chamber, where the baby bees are basically produced and the eggs are laid by the queen, and they raise the baby bees until become adult bees, and this would be the brood chamber. And this beehive actually was designed by Lorenzo Langstroth, an American pastor in the 1850s. Before then, bees were kept in skeps, and they basically did not have any way to inspect those beehives very well. With the Langstroth beehive, he discovered actually to produce a frame that goes down inside of these. In other words, these beehives hold about 10 frames per box or 8 frames per box, depending on what you choose to get. And these frames are able to be pulled out so you can inspect them and find out what their bees are doing. And it's very important, actually. Most states actually require you to have frames, beehives with frames, so they can be inspected by the state apiaries. But Dr. Langstroth, or Lorenzo Langstroth, actually was the author of The Hive and the Honeybee. He was known as the father of modern beekeeping. Some pros and cons of Langstroth beehives. Many different management options. You can inspect them easily. It's easier to extract the honey because, like, if honey is not in a frame type, then you have to kind of cut it off the bar that it's on, or pull it out of the hive somehow and crush it and strain it and to remove the honey. And of course, you have a lot more wax available, but you also have a bigger mess to deal with. Frames do allow for a more stable comb because the comb that's not in frames is easily broken off of the bars that they're on. We'll talk about that briefly here in a minute. There's something called bee space, which is actually 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch. And Dr. Langstroth, or Pastor Langstroth, he actually was kind of coined this term bee space. At least is credited for that. Some cons: amount of weight you must lift, level of invasiveness for the bees. When stacking bees back together, you crush more bees, and there's a cost factor involved because they're not cheap. They can be expensive to purchase. Here's an exploded view of a Langstroth hive. You have the base, and some people don't always use the hive stand, that is, and the base it sits on, or stand that it sits on. You can make your own stands or purchase stands, but This is just one that has a stand on it, but you could actually put this bottom board, the screen bottom board or a solid bottom board, on top of another stand. Then you have a standard brood box, which is we call a deep usually, and some people do use mediums though. However, there's a queen excluder, and some people use them, some people don't use them. And then, of course, anything above that would be called a super. And this is a medium depth super, and there's also a shallow supers too. And then there's an inner cover that goes on top, and then a telescoping outer cover that goes on top of that. The top bar hive, no one really knows who invented the top bar hive. However, it's been used in one form or another for centuries. Some pros and cons of top bar hives are there's no heavy lifting because they're just horizontal and they don't go stack up like a Langstroth does. It will not get to great height, obviously, because it can't. Less invasive for the bees, more natural beekeeping, and sometimes you can put an observation window in there to be able to see what's going on inside the hive. Cons are it's not standardized. People make them in different sizes sometimes. They're not really standardized. Limited space. Once the space gets filled up, there's nowhere for the bees to go, basically. You can't go vertical, so you just have to live with horizontal arrangement. Combs are delicate, and they can basically be broken off the little bars, top bars, easily if you're not careful. You have to crush and strain for the most part to get the honey out. There's more wax and less honey. This looks like a top of top bar hive here. And this shows someone holding the bar where the bees will make the comb and draw it down like you see. You can see the honey at the top, and then you see the brood at the bottom. Sometimes they'll store honey on one side of the top bar sections, and then maybe a brood in one section and honey everywhere else. But you're limited to how far you can go, obviously, horizontally. You can't go vertical with this. And sometimes you actually use a strip called a starter strip right here that'll give them a guide to use to draw this comb downward. Here's another picture of a top bar hive. The war ray hive actually was invented in the late 1800s and early 1900s by a French priest named Emile Warray. Hive is also known as a people's hive because back then people couldn't afford Langstroth hives, so they had to basically purchase or make these. They made the war ray hives, and so you have a bottom box, the deeps, and then you have a cloth as a cover, an inner cover, a quilt box, which is basically a box to help with moisture control. Then, of course, you have your roof on top, which has vents in it. And these hives, the way it works is more natural in that you actually put the boxes on the bottom, so that way they bring the comb downward. The honey is stored in the top boxes, and then the brood is in the bottom boxes. Is how it typically works. The advantages: hands-off approach. You can harvest the entire box. Ladder boxes, optional windows, and there's no foundation. Disadvantage is more difficult to remove than fragile combs because they're on bars. Adding boxes to the bottom can be difficult. And if you add boxes to the top, the supers to the top, it's called supering when you put supers on top, but you put the deep boxes on the bottom on these, and it's called matering. They're not standard, they're hard to inspect, and you have to crush and strain typically to get the honey out, which means you basically destroy the comb and they have to start all over again. So we talk about some equipment and protective clothing. So bottom left, you'll see a gentleman in a very hot coverall type bee suit with leather gloves and then of course a veil. I would suggest if you purchase a bee suit, at least a bee jacket, it should be ventilated. It's going to be a lot easier on you, less hot. In the beginning, you probably will use leather gloves, at least goatskin gloves, something that's real pliable and easily manipulated. The cowhide gloves are just too thick and too cumbersome. Don't even think about buying those. But also, too, you will graduate to using latex leather nitrile gloves, and it's much better than using leather gloves. Believe me, it is. As you get more comfortable keeping your bees. Always, you should wear a veil under any circumstance. I've seen too many people get get stung. They think they can go in there and just look at something real quick, and bam, they get stung on the face or eye, and it's not pretty. Always wear a veil. The middle little tool is called a high pulling tool. I mean, a frame pulling tool. And so, they have their place, and I used to use one, but I don't use them anymore. It's just an extra piece of equipment that they deal with. Um, right hand side is a smoker. I do recommend a large smoker, large size, preferably with the leather type bellows on the back and not rubber. But that's a personal preference. I think they do better though. It lasts longer too. Actually, I've got a smoker from Kelly's Beekeeping. My grandfather is probably about 75 years old. It still works fine. No problems at all. The bottom right is basically shows a frame holder. I do use one of those. I don't like to put frames on the ground, but some people do, and that's okay too. But I like to keep them on the frame holder if I can. Um, Top are the tools. There's various beehive tools. Some of them have J hooks, and some don't. I generally use the long J hook tool in the left middle there, and also use that regular hive tool on the far right. I usually use the J hook tool to pull the frames up out of the high body, and once I get it pulled up out of the high body, I'll switch strictly to the regular beehive tool on the far right hand side. Just use that tool only, but the J hook tools allow you to help you get the first frames out of the hive, especially. It's something that's needed sometimes to pull the frames up if it's stuck to the bottom or stuck to other frames below them. So it does help. These are basically just different size nails. If you desire to build your own boxes or purchase the boxes unassembled, as opposed to having them assembled by whoever you buy them from. Um, so the 7D 2 1/4 inch is the type of nail. That picture actually is really actual size of the nail. It's 2 1/4 inches long, and this is what you use for the boxes, and then the frames, 1 1/4 inch what I use for frames, and then of course a 5/8 inch little for the wedges. And if you have cypress boxes, you want to put them together, you want to use the 8D galvanized 2.5 inch. It's very important. There's special chemicals within cypress trees that can cause damage to regular nails, so galvanized is critically important for that. This is a frame assembling jig, and I use one of these to put together frames if I do them myself. A lot of times I buy my frames already pre-assembled. It's a lot easier and less time consuming, and you can get them, sometimes with foundation already in there, plastic especially, and there are different types of foundation. We'll talk about that later. But this is a frame assembling jig. The way it works is you have little end bars like this. These are called the end bars. You stick them in there all the way across through. It holds 10. And then you want to make sure you use Titebond 3, at least Titebond 2 for sure, but Titebond 3 is better. Glue on every one of these. You can see the top bars. Now these are called top bars right here. They go on top. And then what I do with the top bars is I will actually pre-drill my holes that I use to put nails in with a 1/16 inch drill bit, not through and through, just about 3/4 of the way through each of the top bar, 2 per top bar. Some people use the air compressing type, staple guns, and that's fine too. But I do prefer nails; they seem to hold much better than staples by far. And you can see those there. And these are the bottom bars. Also, you want to glue those two, and I will generally drill just one hole in these and put one nail in each of those. Okay. Now on the end bar, you want to drill a hole opposite side where the wedge is, and the wedge is a little piece of wood. I'll show you later. That holds the foundation in place. But drill a hole through that, and then you put that nail through the end bar into the top bar. This will help keep the top bar from pulling off of the end bars when you try to pull a frame up that's full of honey and or have been stuck to the bottom by wax. That's very important actually to do that. You want to make sure if you do boxes, you just square them up really well as you nail them together. Use lots of Type Bond 3 glue, all the joints. They have finger joints that help you square this thing up. Very important. Okay, so you want to prepare the outside surface of the bee boxes, and most people just paint them with an exterior acrylic latex. And I do advise multicolors, not just white. Use multicolors, pastels and greens and blues and reds and some light, pink even, and just different color, beige, tan, there's various colors, and just that this different colors actually helps reduce what's called drifting. When bees drift from one hive to another, it's just not a good thing to do. Sometimes that can help spread disease. You can actually have your hive boxes dipped in paraffin wax that preserves them for eons of time. Fiberglass resin can be used, a coating. I've done it before. It lasts 2 or 3 years, and it's time consuming, very time consuming process. And then there's a couple of different things you can use to paint the wood with. One's called Eco Wood Treatment. Another one's called QNAP, which is basically a copper type wood treatment that can preserve that wood. I will tell you that cypress wood does last much longer than pine. Be aware of that. There's types of foundation, and the piece on the left actually is wired wax foundation. If you look closely, you can see little hooklets on the end there. They bend the wire up to make it hooklets. So these basically, when you put your frames together and put your foundation inside your frames, the little wires actually go underneath your wedge, and this helps keep it um, from coming loose. The bottom is just some plastic foundation imprinted with the size of honeycomb cells. There's different brands like Acorn, Premier, Right Cell, Permanent, Plasticell. Some of these companies actually do different types of wax coatings, triple wax, heavy wax. It's really, you want to use as much wax as you can on those heavy wax. This allows the bees to draw the comb out a lot quicker on these. And I actually will wax my own. If I use plastic foundation, I just get usually the Right Cell and maybe the Acorn, but certainly I will actually add wax to them also myself. This helps the bees, like I said, draw it out better. Top right is just plastic foundation frames, plastic all the way through and through. This shows here picture of the wax foundation. It's wired wax foundation. Here's the little wedge at the bottom. You can see I nailed those in with little 5/8 inch nails, little small ones. The hooklets are below this little wedge and hold it in place. And then I actually do fishing line, about 12-pound test fishing line, crisscross this on both sides of the foundation in order to keep it straight as possible. Because when you put these into your beehive, especially when it's hot outside, it will tend to warp a little bit. If it does warp a little bit, the bees will not draw it out properly. You want to have it drawn out evenly on both sides. Some people use wire. You can actually purchase, a horizontal wire to wire this foundation in place, and either with embedding it with a tool, or use electrical to kind of melt it slightly to embed it into the wax, tight as possible on both sides to keep it straight and strong. There's a picture there. I also will use bobby pins or foundation pins, which you can purchase from a supply house. This also helps keep the foundation straight. Here is different types of beehive stands. Left is a bench type, and you can just use 4x4 timbers across concrete blocks, and they'll work fine too. You can build your own type of stand, and you can buy metal stands. And people use concrete blocks, like the top right picture. You can see those in the background. Also, too, this regular small hive stand, I do recommend about 11 inches off the ground minimum, mostly because it helps if skunks try to come and try to kill the bees and eat them. Oftentimes, the skunks have to raise up, and so the bees will sting them on their belly and chest area. They don't like that, so it helps deter them from stealing your bees at nighttime and aggravating your bees and killing them and eating them. I do prefer single stands myself instead of the larger bench stands. It just makes it so much easier to inspect them, and you can go from side to side if you have to move across the side, back side to side. On the ones that on the beehive stands that are bench type, I mean, you can obviously work on one side and from the back, but it's making it difficult to work from the other side because you have the beehive sitting there usually. So the single stands to me are better, and you can also keep them farther apart. It's recommended to keep your beehives a minimum of 3 feet apart to help reduce drifting, if not a little more if possible. Maybe more than 3 feet, but 3 foot minimum for sure. So choosing a location, like you want to do full sunshine, it's much better. And basically, or maybe dapple, in the late afternoon, dapple sunshine. But full sunshine is really best, even though it makes it very hard and difficult when you're trying to inspect in the middle of summertime. It can be very hot. However, it's been shown that really and truly, beehives in full sunshine do have less problems with like small hive beetles and other diseases. You want to have them in a good, nice, really, really good, nice location as far as like facing south and southeast is critically important oftentimes because I think that as the sun comes up, especially in wintertime, and even if there's a little bit of snow on there or something or ice, it'll melt off quicker if you face them to the south southeast off the entrance area. Um, so you want a wind barrier on the west southwest side if you can come up with some kind of plan like that too. Maybe natural wind barrier, like even houses can help, trees. Um, And then also too, make sure that your beehive is not located within a flood-prone area. No flooding. You want to make sure that they're high enough off the ground, high enough in their elevation, away from possible flooding areas if it's at all possible. Not too close to neighbors because you don't want your bees aggravating neighbors. And if you can't fix that problem, one of the things you can do is build a fence. Actually, pretty high up, behind around your bees. They will fly up and over instead of flying straight out toward your neighbor's house. They'll fly up and over. Keep that in mind. If possible, not out in the open where everybody can see them. And also check your ordinances. Make sure that your city you live in or township or subdivision allows you to keep bees. It's important to do that. Obviously, you don't want to put a bunch of bees in your neighborhood and not and then be able to have them move them somewhere else. So make sure you check on that. Okay, so we're going to talk about obtaining bees, and there's different ways you can do that. Um, you can order packaged bees from different people, different companies like Man Lake or the Damp. Different other people can also sell them too. But packaged bees can be ordered. If you order packaged bees that come in the springtime, they're going to come out of the south. What they do generally is they'll raise bees in the south because it's a lot warmer earlier on in the season. And what they'll do is they'll take the bees and about the thousands and thousands of them, and they will shake the bees off into a funnel-like thing, into a box that's on a scale, and they'll measure you out about 3 pounds of bees, which is about somewhere around 10,000 bees. They will add in a queen that's been raised somewhere else and mated, hopefully, and laying, hopefully, and then they'll put a feeder can in there and then seal it up and then ship it out. You can order nucleus colony from some of the supply houses. I do highly recommend, however, you purchase nucleus colony from a local beekeeper, especially one that maybe has overwintered in the same area you live in or you're going to have your bees at, because it's just they're acclimated to this area that you live in, and you just know you can get a better colony oftentimes like that. Most of the nukes early on in the season come out of the south, typically. You can purchase an established colony from somebody. They're kind of expensive, but you can do that. Catch a swarm. You can do a cutout. You also want to have 2 or more hives always. I recommend get at least 2 beehives because this way you can kind of observe one hive doing something and look at the other hive and say it's not doing the same thing as far as its growth rates, diseases, and that kind of thing. You might see differences in those two, just to help you know, hey, this is a good quality beehive colony. It's doing great, and then the other one's not. So you can kind of compare, and sometimes you can take resources from one beehive and give it to the other beehive, and like eggs and larvae, for example, and even bees. Sometimes this is kind of help them. Um, okay, So this is actually installing your bees from a package of bees. Now, some of the newer packages come in more of a plastic-looking white box, as opposed to this little Luan box here with screen. But this is the classic way that they get delivered. You got, again, like I said earlier, 10,000 bees in a little box, and you got a can of food in there and a queen. And so what you do is you remove the Luan on the top, and you want to kind of take the staple out of the little queen tab, and then pull the can out, holding the tab in place. Pull the queen out, and then some people will spray, put the Luan back on for a minute, and then hold it in place, and maybe spray a little bit of water, a warm, lukewarm water, and mist them down a little bit. Tap the box down, and then turn it upside down, and it's basically shake the bees out into your hive. And then you want to put the queen, like you see on the bottom left picture. She's on the right hand side there. She's already there already, and they're getting on top of her already because that's the queen. So that's what they always want to go to, the queen, and typically. So that's one way of doing it. The queen caves on the far right hand bottom side will have this little sugar candy or candy inside of there. It's designed for them to eat it. But it's also designed to be essentially a gateway to get into the queen. Over time, as they chew into it, until this will help get her pheromones. By the time they get through it, usually it's like a time release type thing, what it is, and the pheromones get spread, to the rest of the colony, hopefully. But generally, what you do is on the end where the candy is, there's like a little cork that's in there, and you want to remove that cork, and then take open up a good jumbo type paper clip and push it through the candy. That's what I'll try to do usually if I ever do this. I haven't done it in years though. Push the candy, a little hole in the candy. It makes it a little easier for me to get through there, a little bit quicker. Everybody does that. I'm not sure why. It's something people have done for years, but it just makes it easier for me to get through there. So now another way to do this is actually take out 5 frames out of your box. All right, take the queen out and put her to the side like you see her in the middle there. The queen cage needs to go in to where really and truly that the candy end, it should be, I recommend not this way here. I always put my queen cage horizontal and the screen downward. If you do it like this with candy downward, if the attendant bees die in there, they could actually keep her from getting out. So I recommend maybe horizontally instead of vertical like that. But this way you can pull 5 frames out and then put the box in there and then close everything up, and the bees will come out, and go to that queen eventually, and then you come back a couple of days later and remove the box, and the bees will all be out of the box, typically. Make sure you always use an entrance reducer with nucleus colonies that you establish, as well as package bees. Always use an entrance reducer, very important. Possibly even close it up even down to like 2 bee spaces, possibly. This is a nucleus colony being installed, and the way you do this, you again take 5 frames out in the middle, and then you want to gently remove each frame individually out of this little nuke box without having it tilt over, because if you're not careful, it will tilt over on you, because the frame will just kind of tilt it. So be careful and let it fall over. Can you help it? It could kill your queen if you're not careful. But you want to put these in the same order they come out of the box that they came in. Pull it straight up, put them back straight in, same exact orientation, same front entrance, and side to side. So make sure you do that. You could also catch a swarm. And I got a video here, a quick video of me catching a swarm here in my own apiary. It rained the night before. These bees, that's what that sound is, water. They're hitting my tarp at the bottom below me there. And the swarm is pretty large swarm, actually. And I've got a box down there that has a couple of frames of foundation in there. Just gonna, as you can see, it's a pretty good sized swarm there. So hopefully there's a queen in there, which I'm sure there is. And I'm gonna put those into a hive here. It doesn't get much easier than this. This is an easy catch here. They're not always like this, so I do recommend that you don't try to get your bees started like this. If you have somebody you're working with, a mentor personally. All right, so that was the easy catch. They're not always that easy. Feeding your bees, there's a Boardman feeder, hive top feeder, the frame feeder. It's strongly advise you not to use a Boardman feeder on the outside of the entrance. They're designed to go on the outside of the entrance of the beehive. Don't do that. I think you're risking possibly causing robbing in the future if you do that. So if I do use them, I'll use them all internally, and I'll show you that in a minute how to do that. Hive top feeder, basically the bees come up and they feed. There's a screen there to keep them from drowning. There's different types of hive top feeders. Various ones are better than others. The frame feeder is a frame feeder. It goes inside the colony. How you take a frame out and put this frame feeder in place of a frame. You want to make sure you have something in there that floats in there well, so they don't drown. I took a little thin piece of wood, like literally probably an eighth of an inch thickness, maybe a little bit more. Cut holes in it, and it's basically designed to go to the bottom. These are always tapered, as you can see. So I got to make sure that your little piece of wood you cut to fit this thing goes all the way to the bottom, and basically put holes in it so the bees can get the sugar syrup out of there, the feed. And you want to do like what's called 1-to-1 sugar syrup, which means you have 1 part sugar and 1 part water mixture, um, and just kind of put it in there so they can feed. I don't use the frame feeders very much unless I'm doing queen rearing. The Boardman feeders I use like this on the left. I basically just have the quart jars and I put them on in the Boardman feeder. The bees will come up from the hole in the inner cover and they'll come up and feed and take that syrup. And I also cover this whole thing with an empty hive body box. Same thing with the bucket feeder on the right hand side. It's got holes in the lid. You have to put a lot of syrup in there. It's great though, you can do that. And then you put the syrup in there, 1-to-1 sugar syrup, and as you feed your bees, and then there's holes in the lid that allow them to just come up and suck it, But if you got to fill it up enough to where when you turn it upside down, there's a vacuum gets created, and so it doesn't leak out of there. That's very important there. Okay. I don't recommend necessarily feeding a whole lots of protein patties, especially in the spring of the year. If pollen's coming in well, you don't have to feed protein patties that time of year, in my opinion. But there are certain colonies, though, if we're in a situation where there's not a lot of food coming in, I would give them, if I'm trying to build them up, but not too much at one time. That's probably too much right there. You want to probably give at least maybe an eighth of that amount at a time, just enough for them to consume within just a few days. Otherwise, you may end up having small hive beetles get in there and they really go to town, and it's like a small hive beetle factory essentially. So, not too much at one time. I always want to use the entrance reducer. I use mine year round. I never take them out. They're in there year round, and sometimes even close them off even more with by laying a little wooden block in front of there to keep other bees from getting in, robbers from getting in. It gives them less area to have to guard. If you have that wide open entrance, the guard bees really have a hard time. Now, in the spring of the year, whenever there's a good flow on, honey's coming, nectar is coming like crazy, all the flowers blooming. You don't have much problem with robbing, but later on you might. So I just use mine year round. It just makes it easier for me, and I think it's safer for the bees too. Actually, a good supply of water is critically important when you do that. Bees have to have water just like any other animal, for metabolic purposes and also to help break down sugars and so forth, and hard sugar. That's important. The water is, and they like chlorine, and they're attracted to pools a lot of times. You want to start early in the season when you do this, because if you don't, they're going to find another source of water. It could be your neighbor's pool or something, or possibly even your neighbor's fish pond, which is what mine do. I've given them water also too, though. So, and once you get the little colony established, you got your package bees in or your nucleus colony. Go in and inspect it. Probably after a couple of weeks or so, go in and check things out. Make sure that That you see eggs and young larvae. You can see those in there. Eggs and young larvae tells you, hey, the queen is definitely laying, and everything is good, looking good so far. And make sure you have those eggs in there. Oh, by the way, when you do put your package bees in, if you do the installation where you put the whole box inside with the 5 frames, after a couple of days, pull that back out and put your 5 frames back in. 2 weeks later, come back in and check for eggs and larvae. This is just a video of the queen, and you can see the bees around her. And the bees are what they'll do is they're antenating her and licking her to remove pheromones. They spread those pheromones all over the entire colony by trophallaxis, which is active feeding each other. They feed each other constantly and on and off, and they pass those pheromones to each other too. And they know that the queen is there because the pheromone signal's there, and very important. They also feed her constantly, royal jelly, and they also clean her waste away too, because that's all she does is lay eggs. They feed her, they take care of her waste, and they groom her constantly. But she's laid eggs all she does 24/7 for the most part. And a good queen will lay in the summertime, especially about 1,200 to 1,500 eggs a day. So that's literally 1,200 to 1,500 eggs a day is a lot. And that's actually about half of a frame. Each frame has 3,400 cells on each side, and so she'll lay up a half of a frame per day, for the most part. So half of one side of a frame per day. Here she is, a little retinue around her, checking her out, licking her top. Look at that, antenating her. They're picking up pheromones by touching her body with their antennas. She's laying an egg right now. And off she goes to find another spot. Okay, so as you get your colony established with either your package bees or your little nucleus colony that you've installed, they'll tend to draw out the comb from the middle and outward typically. So once you have some comb drawn out, you can go back and inspect and see what they've done. As long as you don't have eggs in those frames that are closer to the middle, just draw comb. You can go ahead and move the comb that's on the end on each side, one spot inward, and just continue feeding them. They'll draw more comb out that way. And then when all of the comb is drawn out, for the most part, at least 70 to 80% of drawn out comb and the bees are there. They're covering 70 to 80%, or they're drawn out 70 to 80% of the wax. Then you want to add a second deep box to that bottom box if you decide to do double stack. Here are some good books to read. Honeybee Biology, Beekeeper's Handbook is a new version of that actually, and the Beekeeping for Dummies is excellent. Honeybee Democracy describes the actual talks about swarming and then how the bees go about preparing for a swarm. It's really, really interesting reading. A lot of the research done by Tom Seeley. But Beekeeping for Dummies is an excellent book for a beginner, especially. Honeybee Biology is kind of a technical, but it's got some really good information too in there too. The Hive and the Honeybee is a great read, but my gosh, it's done in old English, and it's really hard to read, to be honest with you. It's interesting what Lorenzo Langstroth did, and I actually have able to visit the original manuscripts on his. They have them at the library at Cornell University, and they had a EAS conference was up there this past year, and I had the opportunity to actually visit that library and see all that neat stuff. So, a couple more books here: Beecabulary Essentials, lots of information about. It describes because there's actually a vocabulary for beekeepers. Some things you may not ever hear anywhere else except for in the beekeeping world. But this explains to you different things and it gives you definitions about things and explains to them what they are, and it's good information. And the Honey Maker is really a great book to read, and it's actually written by Rosanna Mattingly, and she actually is from Louisville, Kentucky here. So she now lives in Oregon, but it's a great book. All right, and that's the end of this section of the presentation. All right, so this section we talk about um, colony population and how it responds with the availability of pollen. As you can see in the graph, this is a 2 year span, starting in usually the winter solstice comes in December. The queen begins laying eggs more and more as the time goes on. Winter, um, you'll see them start producing a lot more bees inside the brood nest. They gradually increase the brood area. Um, and of course, the queen will only lay enough eggs where they can support the brood. And as the colony continues to grow, um, you'll see the population increase. Um, Generally, late February and into March, the maples begin blooming, and other like henbit and dead nettle. The bees will begin bringing in pollen, and as time goes on, this pollen comes in, and then this is when uh, the colony begins building up, and then in earnest, essentially in April, the pollen really starts becoming in heavy, and this continues to increase the amount of brood that's being produced and the number of bees that are being born, so that hopefully the peak population occurs right when the main honey flow occurs. And as the season goes on, um, summertime comes, we go into what we call a dearth, where there's not many flowers. The bee population begins dropping again, all the way down to again in December. After winter solstice, then the queen begins laying again, and the cycle repeats itself each year. And so this part of the session talks about hive inspection, and we're going to talk about lighting a smoker and different types of smoker media that can be used. There's all kinds of different things that can be used as media to burning your smoker. Um, Generally, I like to use pine needles myself, but you can purchase smoker pellets. You can use untreated burlap pieces, cardboard, cut up cotton T-shirt, cut up cotton jeans, other media. Just got to make sure that whatever you're using is not toxic to the bees, and that's important. Um, Generally, what I do is with the smoker, I will take some paper. Uh, Most of the time, I use the paper that comes with products shipped to me from various beekeeping supply corporations. And this paper generally just can be just a powerful piece of paper, wadded up, light it, stick it down on the bottom of the smoker, and give it a few puffs and get a flame going well. And then you can, at that point, add some more media, like pine needles in there. The pine needles do give off a good, cool white smoke, which is not too bad on your eyes and breathing it, which you will definitely do occasionally. Um, and the cardboard seems to be a little more pungent. T-shirt and cotton jeans are not too bad, and burlap's really good also. But the pine needles will give off a really good, cool white smoke. But as the pine needles are added to the smoker, you want to puff several times, and you can hear a change basically the way it sounds. You'll as you experience this, the flames start coming up, and you can tell it's really catching on fire really well down inside. You want to get a good base of coals in there in the bottom of the smoker. Pack the media down, the pine needles, whatever, down deeper, and then can keep adding more and more as you go until the whole entire smoker chamber is completely filled with the media. And pack it down as high as you can get it. It'll last a long time as you do your hive inspection. You want to do some observation at the hive entrance as you go to the beehive. Um, so look at what's happening at the front of the entrance. If you see, pollen coming in, if the bees are active, um, you can kind of tell, what's happening. They're bringing in nectar. You can see the abdomens oftentimes will be stretched and somewhat translucent, so you can see they're full of nectar coming in. Bees oftentimes do what was called orientation flights, usually in the afternoon. The young bees that are emerging After about 3 weeks after they've emerged, they become foragers. And what they'll come out of the hive, they'll crawl up the front of the face of the hive, and then they'll fly off and do more of a figure eight pattern, which is orientation flights. You can see them do that. Um, it's important to know the difference between that and robbing situation. Oftentimes, robbers will try to get into other areas of the hive, not the main entrance, and they're just a little bit different how they act around the entrance of the hive. And other bees will be trying to fight them, and oftentimes falling to the ground, struggling with each other, fighting each other. That's a robbing. That's something you're probably not going to see in the springtime. Typically, usually it's later on in the summertime in the dearth. You'll see that happen. Um, but as far as smoking is concerned, I'll generally puff a couple of puffs in the entrance of the hive before I actually start into my inspection. A couple of puffs in the entrance, 2 or 3 puffs in the entrance there in the beginning. Wait a few minutes afterwards. Now I'm going to show you this little video clip of bees, the normal behavior coming in. They're bringing pollen in. You'll see them bringing pollen in. This is a normal hive of bees, normal activity. They're on a mission here to collect this pollen and bring it in as quick as they can, and nectar too. As you can see, it's a good pollen flow, and the bees are really healthy and active. All different colors of pollen, you have oranges and yellows coming in. Okay, some smoker tips. Smoking the hive, like we said a while ago, you just want to smoke the hive entrance, 2 or 3 good puffs in there, making sure your smoker's got a good flow of white smoke coming out. Then I generally do is I'll remove the top cover and smoke a little bit underneath the top cover, making sure that you get a good amount of smoke in there. This will help calm the bees down. And then what you want to do is at that point remove the inner cover, and you remove the inner cover, and you want to puff a few puffs before you do that into the hole of the inner cover. And then after you pop up the inner cover very slowly, try not to make a loud popping sound with it as you pull up the inner cover. Smoke a few puffs inside there, and then you gradually pull the inner cover off, and you may smoke a little bit on the top of the frames. Don't smoke directly into the frames, but over top of them. If the wind is blowing heavy, you'll have to come to one side or the other, depending on which way the wind's blowing at that point, and go ahead and smoke so that the smoke flows over the top of the bees. And as you do your inspections, you may have to smoke more inside the hive to calm the bees down. You'll be able to tell as you do the inspections what I'm talking about here. As far as using your hive tools, again, I use the J hook and other hive tools to kind of break apart. You want to kind of break apart the frames with the propolis gently, separate them. Then also too, I would oftentimes remove the frame that's near the edge, of the next to the wall, the first frame. However, sometimes that frame can be glued to the wall via wax, and if you tend to pull it up, you may end up causing some severe damage to the comb that's already there. Especially if it's got honey in it, it can cause a big problem. You can actually just pull the comb off, and honey will be oozing everywhere. So take a close look down inside there before you pull it off and pull the frame out. And also too, I tend to start my inspection. You look at the colony in the hive itself. Usually there's more bees on one side or the other on next to the wall. So start your inspection on the side where the bees are less. In other words, don't start where there's more bees. Start where there's less bees, and that way you won't. It'd be easier on the bees as you do this in your inspection. Sometimes you got to take out the second frame instead of the first frame, especially if that first frame is glued to the wall, and just gradually pull it up out of there. I usually take out 2 frames as I do my inspection, inspect those quite well, and then hang those on a frame holding device. So Also, too, as you pull the frames, make sure you pull them straight up and not to the side or angled. If you do that, you'll tend to roll bees more. And if you roll the queen, it can be big trouble. Putting the frames back the same way, you'll put them back the same way as they come out, very gently. I oftentimes will either smoke on the edges or blow down inside there to make the bees move off the end bars, and then gradually push the frame back inside. And make sure the frames are in the same order they come out. Unless you're doing some manipulation, which I oftentimes do, then you don't do that, obviously. And be mindful of bee space. Make sure you squeeze the frames together, together inside the core. So that's important. Here you see lady inspecting a beehive. Here you have this frame has emerging brood in the middle, and you can see it's the outward edges of this have a cat brood still. But generally, I don't pull frames from the middle of the beehive like this lady is doing. I generally start, like I said earlier, on the first frame or second frame in on there. So when you look at the frames, you're going to see various types of cap brood and open brood, and worker cells and drone cells are always oriented horizontally, and then your queen cells are going to be oriented vertically. As you can see, the cells are the cap brood cells just above the bottom there on the horizontal orientation. That's all worker brood, and above that you'll see the drone brood, just a larger, almost like a dome shape. Cocoa puff appearance. The bottom cells, the long ones at the bottom, those are all queen cells. Queen cells, we name queen cells based on oftentimes what they're there for and their location. Generally, if you look in this left top picture, it's a queen cup, and that's on the right hand side, and then to the left of that is a queen cell. Okay, and that is probably something called a supersedure cell, which is basically where there's something wrong with the old queen, so they decided that they wanted to replace that queen for whatever reason, so they can replace the queen with one of her daughter queens. On the right hand side top, you'll see what we would call emergency queen cells, and this is where something happened to the queen, and they actually modified one of the cells to make a queen cell. They can take an egg or a 1 to 2 day old larvae, and they can break the wax down and then bring that downward like that and make this queen cell downward vertically. And this will be called emergency queen cell. And of course, the cells at the bottom on the bottom right picture, usually located on the bottom, those are called queen swarm cells. And the swarm queen cells are generally there for, obviously, when the beehives are ready to swarm. And the reason they say that they make the queen cells for swarming on the bottom is because that at that point the queen does not get on the bottom of the comb very often, so her footprint pheromone is not down there as much. So that's why they make queen cells in the bottom. The footprint pheromone helps stop queen cell production. So because she doesn't come to the bottom of the frame very often, there's less footprint pheromone. That's at least the theory. Here's a frame basically from a mating nuke. It shows very normal cat brood. And this is a good frame of cat brood right here. Here's another good frame here. You can see where they did not draw out the comb completely on the edges, the bottom, but the middle is obviously very, very good, high quality cat brood, and a very good brood frame. Here you see cat brood with pollen at the top of the brood, and then honey above that, and the rainbow-like appearance. This is classic presentation here. Always be mindful of the queen, and making sure that that you don't damage her. Keep her protected at all times is very important. Some people will actually remove the queen from the hive completely as they do their inspection. Others may actually, if they find the queen on a frame, they may pull the frame all the way out and maybe put her into on the frame into a corrugated plastic nuke box, keeping her safe. Here's a queen with her retinue. This is basically her entourage. You can see all the bees surrounding her. The bees will feed her, remove her fecal material wastes, and also they intonate and also lick her to transmit their pheromones. And they take the pheromones in, and they actually, with trophallaxis, the act of feeding each other with, they do this, and they pass their pheromones to other bees in the colony. So they always know that they have a queen inside the colony because of her pheromones. Here you see eggs. When she lays an egg, it's going to be vertical, and after about a day or so, it then falls down flat, and on day 3, it'll actually melt into a larvae. This is uncapped wet brood or milk brood. It's uncapped brood, and this is basically where the queen has laid up this frame with worker brood in the middle. And as she lays out, she'll lay in more of a concentric pattern or circular pattern, and so that the middle basically is the middle is cap brood, and as she goes outward, you'll see the larvae are larger, and then as you go farther out, they're smaller, and then finally to eggs. And this is how she lays her pattern essentially. So this is wet brood or milk brood. This picture here shows it better. You can see all the larvae, and you see how wet they look. That is very important that they do look this wet because this is where they got plenty of food being fed to them. The larvae are glistening white. Anything white is right, and you make sure the larva is white and got plenty of food in there and wetness. That's very important. This is a frame of emerging brood where you have essentially well, the queen has laid out the middle first. The middle has emerged, and then as the bees emerge, as they mature to emerge, you'll see this pattern where the middle basically is where the bees were emerging, and now they're emerged, and then the periphery is bees are still emerging. Um, so what they'll do is they'll go back and clean up this. Clean up the middle these cells, and when they clean up the cells, the queen can go back and lay in those cells. And this is something called nosinofing. And nosinofing is where they actually will bend down their 7th abdominal segment, and as they do this segment here, there's a gland inside here, and they actually will spray out this pheromone called nosinoff pheromone. And this nosinoff pheromone is more of an orientation pheromone, and it basically allows other bees to know, hey, this is home, and you'll smell this odor. It's really interesting. They'll spray it and they'll fan it with their wings, and nosinoffing it almost has a lemony smell to it. It smells like lemon, as opposed to alarm pheromone, which is whenever you get stung. People say, well, it smells like bananas, but the lemon smell is just nosinoff. It's a orientation pheromone smell. So bees exhibit something known as temporal polyethism, or age-related division of labor. And this has to do as they emerge, they have various tasks they do going through from the time that they emerge until they fly out and become foragers. And starting out with cleaning the brood nest is once the young worker bee emerges, she will begin cleaning out the actual cell that she came out of, and then she'll start feeding on some protein or pollen or what we call bee bread. The pollen basically is the pollen is in there. We showed it earlier in the frame. Is they pack it inside there, but as they do this, they add enzyme, a little bit of enzyme to it. Also, they add yeast to it naturally, and this actually ferments the pollen granules. And the pollen needs to be fermented to break down the enzyme on the actual pollen, little individual pollen cells. This makes it available to be fed to the larvae and be utilized by the bees. But as the young bee gets fed, when she first emerges, it takes about 5 days, and once 5 days goes by, her glands in her head, also known as a hypopharyngeal as well as mandibular glands mature, these glands produce the brood food, and they make different types of food. They make royal jelly, which is called queen jelly. They also make worker jelly and drone jelly, and each of those has different components. But depending on what they're feeding, they feed various components to these larvae. If they're feeding worker larvae, they feed them worker jelly. The first 3 days, all larvae get fed royal jelly. After that, they change to worker jelly, which is a different protein consistency. The worker jelly has more protein, and the queen or royal jelly has more carbohydrate. They also can feed the queen, depending on if they're one of the bees that's feeding the queen, they'll feed her royal jelly, which has, like I said, more carbohydrate. Um, and then some bees then graduate to what we call nectar ripening jobs, and they will basically go down to the bottom of the entrance and where the bees are coming in with nectar and receive nectar from the bees coming in. Those bees will give that nectar from their honey crop into the proboscis of another bee, and the bee takes it upstairs, puts it in the honey super, and then she'll actually will suck it in and blow it out, suck it in, blow it out, suck it in, blow it out, and add bubbles to it, and basically dehydrate that honey. Simultaneously, as this process is going on, enzymes have been added to break down the sucrose, which is basically table sugar. Sucrose is a disaccharide, and they break it down with invertase or sucrase into glucose and fructose, which is what makes up the most of the honey component. And as they dehydrate it, then as time goes on, they also use the fanning process or fan their wings over it to dehydrate it. They want to get it down to about 18%, roughly 18% or less, and this will help preserve that honey. The glucose and fructose is there. Dehydration all preserves that honey and ripens it to be real honey that can be stored. And then once it's stored and ripened, they cap it over with wax, and that's what makes the capped honey. Now, other bees actually have pollen. They bring pollen back, and these foragers come back. Well, those bees actually they actually come up and kick the pollen off their legs, and they go back out to get more pollen. Well, the pollen's kicked off their legs into the cell. Well, other bees, the young bees, are up there, and they actually will go in and pack that pollen into. They'll take their heads and ram their heads into the cell and push the pollen deeper into the cell and pack it in there, pack it as hard as they can get it, so they can go through the fermentation process to make bee bread. Some bees then graduate; they'll make comb builders. They start producing wax, and they'll start building comb and repairing places and so forth. They do this comb building, and then some bees will eventually graduate to be guard bees at the entrance. These guard bees are at the front entrance, and it's not many of them usually, but they'll actually protect the entrance of the hive. As bees come in, they'll actually raise up their legs and inspect each bee that comes in very quickly. And as they graduate and start, after they do their orientation flights, become foraging bees or flying outside some, they become undertakers. They actually will take out any dead bees that have aged or whatever's happened to them. They may die inside the hive. They will take the bee outside and fly with it. You see a bee come out holding another bee in its mouth or legs, and then fly off and then drop the bee somewhere, and they come back, and they'll just remove the bees out of the hive, get rid of them. And then, of course, they become foragers, and bees, after 3 weeks, they become foragers typically. And these foraging bees, they'll forage for, nectar and pollen and water, and even some of them go get tree sap to make propolis out of that, and which just makes the bee glue. Here's a picture of festooning, and this is where the bees are actually in the process of building comb. And they will actually, as they producers produce wax, they pass the wax down one to another, and as they do this, they actually hold each other, pass the wax cells down, and then make the comb and form it onto the hive. They do this to have the comb being produced in a downward motion. Now we're going to briefly talk about some conditions that we might see as we do our inspection. We're not going to get into extreme in-depth talk about this disease. This will be in the fourth session, third and fourth session actually. So keep that in mind. We're not going to get into extreme detail, but some detail. This is called ball brood, and what this is basically where it's thought that a larva from either a small hive beetle or a wax moth is migrating below the capped cells against the foundation or midrib of that comb, and the other bees sense that larva migrating. As a result of this, they will actually uncap these cells in a straight line typically, or sometimes it's a little erratic, but usually it's linear, and they're trying to get the larvae out of there, but sometimes they're not successful at doing that. It's called ball brood because basically that's not supposed to be uncapped. That's a pupa in there. That's a pupa, so they should be capped over. Then we'll see sometimes on a rare condition is called chalk brood, and chalk brood is actually caused by a fungus called Ascophera apis, and Ascophera apis is just a fungus that gets inside the larva. It's a disease, and it causes the larva to die, and then the fungus basically takes over the entire pupa, and you'll see them are in larva, and you'll see them. Here's a picture here of one that has died, and then this fungus takes over the entire thing and basically turns it into a chalk-like substance. Hence, it's called chalk brood. And the bees will drag out these mummies, mummified. They're basically mummified. They bring the mummies out, and you see them on the in front entrance here. They're trying to get rid of them, but that's chalk brood. This condition is called sac brood. Remember, I said earlier you want to see the larva needs to be glistening and white, but these little young pre-pupa, essentially, it's basically this virus prevents the pupa from molting. Its last stage, the larva actually is not allowed to molt to the last stage to become a pupa, and so you'll see this weird configuration where the heads are sticking up like this, like almost like little boats. It's a classic presentation of sac brood virus. Okay, this is European foul brood, and the larvae, as you see, are not white. They're not glistening white. They're kind of off color and light brown. It's a bacteria. Melissococcus plutonius bacteria will cause this to occur. This is an infection. The larvae are fed infected bee bread essentially from other bees, and they spread this bacteria around that kills the larva. It kills the larva before they're capped over, actually. There's a better picture here. You can see this one's twisted in the cell. It's a classic presentation. You can see there's eggs still there. The queen still lays, but as they get fed by the worker bees that are feeding them, the nurse bees we call them, the young bees that are feeding the other bees are called nurse bees. And these are they're dying essentially. This little larvae are. So they at the end it dries out completely. It makes like a scale. The scale is easily removed, and this is a bacterial infection. There are test kits available for it. This one is an advanced case of American foul brood and other bacteria. This is Penibacillus larvae. It's spore-forming bacteria, nasty disease. Very, very foul smelling. Both of these conditions do smell. American foul brood smells way worse than American foul brood smells way worse than European foul brood does. It's a much more devastating condition. Here you see this is called the Ropey test, and you can take one of the larvae with the American foul brood, actually a capped cell that's maybe indented. Some of these cells here, you can tell, but they're opened up, have holes in them, and the sunken cappings. It's this real gooey mess, stinky, very, very putrid odor. But you can take one of the, like a matchstick or a little piece of straw, go into one of these cells and stir it up a little bit and pull out. And what you're going to get is a stringy appearance of the melted larvae, essentially decaying larvae and pupa. And this is just, it strings out about over an inch. And this is a real snot-like substance, and it strings out and ropes out like this over an inch. That's pretty classic for American foul brood. And this is called a pupal tongue. They're very rare to see, but it basically is where the pupa has died inside the cell and shrunk downward. Part of the pupa is still attached to the roof of this, of the top of this little cell, and it gives the appearance of a tongue-like appearance. It's not really a tongue, but just part of the skin of the larva or pupa attached to the roof of this or top of this cell. And these scales form also inside here, like the European foul brood, but the scales in this case are very, very, very tight. You can't get them loose. They stick to the cells. You can't remove them, and that's one of the signs also. Just a nasty disease. There's also a test kit available for it, American foul brood test kit. Vita makes that. Easy to run if you ever suspect that. If you do ever suspect American foul brood, you want to call the state apiarist immediately. This is a reportable disease, and the way you deal with the situation here is American foul brood. You want to burn the colony, kill the bees, and burn the colony. Preferably kill the bees with hot soapy water, and then you dig a hole in the ground somewhere, put all the bees and beehives, everything associated with that hive and or hives that have been diagnosed, and burn them, destroy them, and then cover up the dirt so that way they can't come in and take anything left over and spread this condition around. This can devastate an industry very quickly. It's important that you report this to state apiarists immediately if you suspect it, and then get rid of those colonies by burning them. This frame here is a frame of drone brood, and if you can see, notice that it's more of a cocoa puff appearance as opposed to the flatter cells that you'll see. And this is either this is from a queen breeder that is producing drones on purpose to allow the area to be saturated with drones, so that way whenever the queens are released to be mated, then this as the queens go out, they'll have more availability of drones to mate. You'd want to put this colony at least a quarter to half a mile away from your main apiary as in a breeding program. And or also too, you can purchase a green color frame, which is a plastic drone frame, and it's part of integrated pest management to help kill varroa mites. And this is done as part of the management of varroa mite. You basically will put the frame in, and then once it's laid up like this, you pull it out, freeze it back in the freezer for about 48 hours or so or longer, and then get it back out and let it thaw, and then stick it back in the hive and let the bees remove all the dead drone pupa out of there, as well as the mites. And that's very important, part of integrated pest management. I don't use it that well as much as some people do, but some people do use them. I don't really use them that much. It's just a lot of extra work on my part to do that, but it can be used to help. This is a situation where you may have a queen that has not been mated well, or she's old and running out of sperm. Queens mate, 2 times roughly on the average of 15 drones each time. And but sometimes they don't mate well if the weather's not good or something like that can happen, and so they can run out of sperm. You can see this is queens laying this and not laying worker situation, because there are areas of normal worker brood. And so if you see even one cell of worker brood, that tells you this was laid by a queen and not laying workers. So all this mess here basically is just nasty, discombobulated drones, and so that queen may need to be culled out. Obviously, should be culled out, removed, and replaced immediately. This is parasitic mite syndrome. You can see there's a lot of uncapped brood here. And here you can see they've uncapped the brood because these bees are somewhat sensitive, and they've detected that there are mites inside this colony. And here you can see in the second picture, clearly the mites are on the dying pupa here. Parasitic mite syndrome. This is what happens if you don't control your varroa mites. Devastating situation. The colony basically is going to collapse. That colony is going to probably not make it at all. It's going to collapse and die. Okay, so this actually is a frame of laying workers, because there are no worker brood signs whatsoever. So it will becomes as a laying worker hive. And what happens is the queen has either been killed, or something happened to her, or maybe she was a young queen and flew out and didn't make it back from a mating flight, and the beekeeper did not, you know, check on this colony in time, or whatever could have happened to the queen, something that made them go queenless, and they did not requeen. And therefore, as time goes on, since the pheromone levels drop, and or there's not any good worker pheromone here, over time, these worker bees ovaries enlarge, and then they begin laying eggs. But there's a haploid diploid system where that means is the all females are diploid. They have two sets of chromosomes, and all males are haploid. They only have one set of chromosomes, and that one set comes from the queen only, and or a worker. Because if they have just one set of chromosome, it becomes a drone. Two sets, it can be either worker or queen. Um, and because the workers cannot be mated or not mated, then they lay these drone cells, and you get this weird, uneven looking appearance to the drone brood, and you'll see just worker laying worker situation. And here is a classic presentation where you see the workers, laying workers, have laid multiple eggs and cells. That is a classic presentation of a laying worker situation. It's just a mess. It can be dealt with as a proper way to do that, and we're not going to get into details on how to do that at this point. All right, and that's the end of this section. And now we're going to just briefly go through this beekeeping calendar. The calendar is originally adapted from John Benham, an Eastern Apicultural Society uh, certified master beekeeper and good friend of mine, and also it's been modified by Jay Barker, also Eastern Apicultural Society master beekeeper, and a Cornell University master beekeeper, Cornell master beekeeper. Um, Jake actually is going to be doing the fourth session of the Beginner Beekeeper Series. So I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but in January there's not much activity. Obviously, the brood numbers are increasing because the queen has started to lay again in earnest. Their spring comes way earlier than ours does. This is important to start at this point to confirm how much um, weight, stores, so forth are left behind or in the colony. Uh, Whether or not you should add any supplemental feeding or not. And so I do add feed to all my bees, sugar cake, regardless if needed or not. A lot of beekeepers will do that. Some do not, and there's various ways you can feed the sugar, either candy or sugar candy, sugar cake, plain sugar, fondant, etc. You might see sometimes as you go and check whenever the temperature is 45 degrees or greater to see if you need to replace any supplemental feeding that you may have there already or have to add it. Just be aware. One of the things you can do is maybe take a picture of this each slide as we go, and you can take a picture and have this calendar available for yourself. Um, you don't want to spend much time in the hive. Don't linger around too long. Smoke as little as possible, if at all, and just be very careful. At this point in time of the year, I also want to do a lot of studying and reading, and any work that you might have to do with your getting your hives ready, that kind of thing, frames ready, and so forth. Because spring will come here before you know it. So get things ready. February, brood numbers and adult bee population is still increasing slightly. Again, they're consuming food that's inside the colony, and this is a time when a lot of times, if you don't have ample stores in there, the colony can starve to death. Um, so swarm preparations are underway already at this point. Just keep that in mind. And as early spring rolls around, the maple trees begin blooming late spring, sometimes late February, that is. Um, and also, too, henbit can be blooming at this point. That we're bringing in henbit, which is a dark red color. so is dead nettle. Some people will add at this point. I do late February, early March. Sometimes go ahead and add some small amount of winter patty, which is basically mostly sugar, but some protein. Just don't add too much at one time if you can help it. In March, this is a month that things really begin happening, and depending on the weather conditions, obviously, good conditions can stimulate a lot of brood increase, and a lot of bees will be emerging every single day, and the brood area is expanding rapidly. Poor conditions, obviously, long bad winter, lots of rain, cold weather. They have to consume food inside, so you're going to start having them starve to death even more. You got to make sure they have food available because weather can change in Kentucky, especially very quickly. We can have cold springs and sometimes not so cold. Some years are great, some years are not so great. If you're going to feed anything that you can feed, any sugar syrup at all whatsoever, if you have to feed them at all, um, 1 to 1 is what you're going to use on that. 1 part water, 1 part sugar. But you can also still feed the solid foods, like sugar cake and different types of hard candy. Again, add protein patties if you need to. Just kind of make sure they're small strips, not too much at one time because you can cause small hive beetles to really increase. So at this point in time, it might be a good time if you can rotate your boxes, and I'll discuss that later on in the presentation about how to rotate boxes. This is done to help as part of your swarm prevention techniques, and you can also prepare for splits. So there's different ways you can do splitting. You don't want to split this too early in the season because you got to make sure you do your splits whenever there are drones available for queens to mate with. So if you're going to do splits, do it whenever they want to do swarming and splitting. And a lot of times that's in late April or early May, in my opinion. Um, Also, too, if we've had a warm spring, very warm spring, you might want to at this point go ahead and add some honey supers. Um, because if there's a flow coming on, you want them to go ahead and start placing that nectar in some honey supers if possible. April is really things are ramping up heavy at this point. Lots of trees are beginning to bloom. Your maples, especially, and others, various other things, pussy willows and maples and other trees and plants can be blooming at this point, and lots of pollen coming in and nectar coming in, some nectar coming in. Um, so generally, you want to have plenty of room in there too. You may have to add some honey supers to give them space. Also, at this point, it's very important you do that. Um, Sometimes you can do some checkerboarding of frames to relieve some of the swarm pressure. Um, so keep that in mind. So you'll see conditions occur, the wet weather diseases like European foul brood we talked about earlier, sac brood, and nosema, chalk brood. You want to be prepared to deal with them. Requeening the colony is often indicated. You may not be able to requeen yourself at this point, but you may have to purchase a queen, or that is raise your own queen. But because if the drones aren't available at this point, you may not be able to actually produce a new queen and get her mated well. But if you have drones available at this point, you can do that. Um, the earliest splits in queen rearing start, late April, like I said, early May. Um, the weather is so unpredictable that time of year; it can make things more difficult to get queens mated and split right. May is much easier. In May, much of what will happen in May was carried over from April. The population continues to increase, and nectar and pollen begin coming in plentiful. Um, Colonies that were slow building in April because of wet weather, disease, whatever, may show signs of recovery and begin building accordingly. Sometimes they build very fast, faster than you realize, and they may actually start swarming pretty quickly on you if you're not careful. Um, and then hive inspections now become a real chore because everything's getting heavy as far as honey supers and so forth. Removing them, boxes get heavy. Um, you want to continue adding supers, as this is the time of the year that we want to really take advantage of the honey flow or nectar flow, we call it. You want to make sure you have extra supers on there, mostly because you need extra supers so they can put the nectar in there. Because nectar is very wet, it's very very high moisture water percentage, and because of this, they have to actually fan it and dry it out to make into honey. So if you don't have ample space, to put this extra nectar, they won't bring it in like they need to. So extra, you can over super basically have more than you need at this time of year, especially. It's very important. That's one of the worst things you can do is don't have sufficient numbers of supers on there when the time comes for the nectar to be flowing. It can really mess up your honey crop. So lots of extra supers there are important at that time of year. Um, so at this point too, depending on your mite counts, if you do mite counts, it might be a good time to go ahead and start treating for mites, and those products you can use while the honey supers are on. In June, the colony population peaks, and a major spring flow comes to an end, and then swarming then starts to wane. Um, as the daytime temperatures begin to warm the 80s and 90s, nectar curing and honey capping become a major focus of the colony, along with ventilation to aid in the curing process and cool the brood chamber. Again, you want to have a fresh supply of water somewhere available, either a creek somewhere close by, or you have to provide it for them. Um, So also too, as the season goes on, be aware that you want to have your interest reducers in at always. And so as the season goes on into July, we can enter into what we call a dearth, which is a lack of food sources coming in, and sometimes the guard bees become a little more defensive. So be aware of that. In July is normally a very dry and hot month. When summer dearth begins, if you're not careful, and sometimes the colonies can actually have a lack of food coming in, so they appear to be starving, and so they can the queens will back off laying eggs quite a bit, and oftentimes the colonies appear to be queenless. People say, "Well, I don't have a queen because I don't see any eggs," but they may have a queen, but she's just not laying. So that's something to think about. Um, the mite population will dramatically increase at this point because the bee numbers are dropping because of the dearth. As the season goes on, especially the bee numbers begin dropping, yet the mite levels are still high, and so there are more mites on each bee if they're there. So you're going to have more chance of them getting diseases, as viruses, especially. Obviously, we're talking about viruses transmitted by the mites and varroa mite. So it's important that you keep that in mind, and you'll see um, some serious issues if you don't deal with that problem as time goes on. You want to provide water source again, and one of the things you can see too, it gets real hot and humid outside. The bees oftentimes, even at nighttime, will be bearding out front, meaning they'll just come out to the outside and hang down from the entrance, and we call that a bee beard. Essentially, they're bearding. The reason they do that is because it's hot inside there. They want to stay outside and keep that temperature inside the colony at 95 degrees. Um, and not too hot, not above that. So it's hot and humid times. They'll be outside, and it's not uncommon at all. Um, so at this point in time, usually the end of July, most people begin pulling their honey supers, and they'll pull those honey supers off, and go ahead and start extracting the honey at the end of July, typically. Now, you may not have honey supers on because if you're an early young beekeeper, it's a beginning beekeeper course, obviously, you may not have honey supers on because you haven't got to that point where the beehive is strong enough to have even support honey. What you're trying to do at this point is to in the very beginning to get that colony through the first summer and into the wintertime and overwinter them. And the next year, you oftentimes can put them on. Now, you may, if you start with a nucleus colony, you might end up having the ability to put some honey supers on. But usually, if you go with a package bees, you're not going to be able to get honey the first year. Keep that in mind. Um, okay. Also, too, at the end of the July, or early part of August is when we, at that point, go on and do our mite treatments after the honey supers are pulled. Um, Again, if there's not a lot of food that's been coming in, they may not have packed a lot of food into the deep box, the top deep box especially. And so it's important to kind of get an idea of how much food is there because they can starve to death even in the summertime. You got to make sure that you don't pull too much honey. Make sure you pull the honey, that there's plenty of honey inside the brood boxes. Um, so if you haven't done this before, you want to do mite checks and treatment is indicated. Generally, we'll talk about this later on about how to treat and what to treat with. Use Apivar and Aprigard are the two popular things that time of year to treat. Um, Also, you want to test your colony after the fact to make sure that the mite treatment is actually, in fact, did work. This time of year, also, the drone populations begin dropping. And because of that, queen mating success becomes very difficult. And there's less drones in the outside. I just don't recommend trying to raise queens in August. Try to do them if you can. In May and June is the best time to do queen rearing, in my opinion. September, colonies and starvation can appear queenless again. So what you look for, as we talked about earlier, is if you have brood in there, look for to make sure that that if there is brood in there, that it has plenty of nutrition. They have plenty of nutrition, and you want to see glistening cells. Essentially, larvae should be glistening and white and just wet looking. If not, you may have to add in some more pollen at that time of the year, possibly, even possibly feed that colony some 1-to-1 sugar syrup, um, especially if they don't seem to be doing well. So make sure you feed them well. Make sure they have plenty of stores. This time of year in September, obviously, you're going to start seeing more yellow and white wingstem blooming, well as boneset goldenrod and asters. Um, the flow quality can be very erratic. It depends on the year. Every year is different. At that point of the year, too, if you have more than one colony, several colonies, you want to do culling and combining, requeening, and mite treatments. All this should be done and getting ready to be finished up here this time of year. So it's important this time of year also, too, that you've done your mite treatments and make sure they have plenty of nutrition. And the reason being is because at this point of the year, the colony is wanting to produce what is known as winter bees. And these bees are basically bees that will live through the winter and get the colony through until springtime. Um, they got to be healthy. If you don't deal with mites early in the year, like in July, get rid of those mites as best you can with treatments and testing because they will harbor a lot of viruses and give viruses to your bees and spread the viruses to your bees. And that's what can cause serious damage to the bees. You want healthy bees because those bees in the late summer are going to be responsible for producing the next generation of bees, which will produce the winter bees. And those bees have to last through the whole entire spring. And so if they're not healthy, they can't produce healthy bees. And so it's important that they stay healthy all through the late summer and early fall time period. Um, the bees, their fat bees, are called winter bees. Essentially, have their different physiology than the summer bees. Summer bees live about 6 weeks, and then winter bees live about 5 months. And there's a difference in their physiology. They have more vitellogenin stored in their fat bodies. And this will help them survive through the wintertime and also feed any brood that's being produced in the spring. And if you don't have good winter bees, it will negatively affect your spring buildup, which is important to have. Um, so I have to give them small amounts of and certain types of nucleus colonies and or splits I've made. We'll get sometimes some winter patty type patties, little protein to help them out if they need it. Again, small amounts at a time. Watch out for the small hive beetles. Again, so also too in September, I recommend at this point to put on the mouse guards. Usually, I just use a half-inch hardware cloth to keep mice out. That does a pretty good job doing that. I've never had a problem with them with a half-inch hardware cloth. You could actually purchase mouse guards, from your various supply stores, but you don't have to do that. Just use a hardware cloth and staple it to the front entrance, and that they keep the mice out. Um, some people do use upper entrances. I don't usually use them because our winters here are not that severe, and then we don't usually get snow um, lasting a very, very long time. I do advise pointing your beehives again to the south or southeast. That way, if the sun does come up in wintertime, it will melt off any snow or ice at the entrance typically pretty quickly. Um, if there's long periods of cold weather where snow and ice is still there for a long time, the bees won't be out anyway. So when the sun comes out and gets warm, it's going to melt off the ice pretty quickly. I don't have a problem. I've never had a problem with that. Now, if you live up in northern part of the United States in Vermont, you need an upper entrance. In this part of the country, you don't need an upper entrance really at all. I don't recommend that at all. Um, so, October, um, too late to make queens. Obviously, there's very, very, very little drones out there to mate with them. Um, you make sure they have plenty of food, and make sure your colonies are heavy. And basically, if you heft or pick up the back of the hive, it should feel like a box of rocks essentially at this point. If it does not, you need to feed them. And at this point, you want to feed the 2-to-1 sugar syrup, and or go ahead and put on the candy boards or fondant raw sugar on top of the frames. And I'm going to go in details about that later on in the presentation. Um, so a lot of the point in time, usually around October 15th, it's the first frost typically in this part of the country. And at this point, if it freezes, a lot of your flowers will then at that point fade. Um, the asters usually stay on a little bit longer, and they can still bring in pollen. And witch hazel actually continues blooming for a while longer, actually. So you'll see some pollen coming in from that. Um, I generally go ahead and do my first mite treatment around Halloween, and then I do it again in November and in December also. Um, so keep in mind, about that what time of the year it is, for treatment. I prefer to be 45 degrees or greater. Some say 37 degrees Fahrenheit is minimum for that. I like 45 degrees myself, but 37 is the minimum temperature to treat. Otherwise, the cluster's too tight. And oxalic acid vaporization, um, which we'll talk about that later on, needs to be done at this point as a cleanup measure. I would not rely on it exclusively for mite treatment of my bees, just a cleanup in the fall of the year. November. Sometimes you'll see bees flying out on warm days. And this is not uncommon. November actually had some warm days in it this year, and the bees were flying, several days. But so on the warm days, you'll see them flying occasionally, just to do cleansing flights. Keep in mind they still need water supply somewhere. They use water to break down the hard feed, sugar cake, and so forth. Oxalic acid treatment usually around Thanksgiving. A lot of people do it that time of year. December marks the end of the broodless period. That is, the broodless period meaning the queen has stopped laying, and now she's going to begin laying again after the winter solstice, like we described earlier. Keep an eye out for food supplies again. It's very important as this time goes on. Observe your bees flying occasionally, and if it's warm outside, um, they'll fly occasionally. If it gets like 55 degrees, they'll start flying a little bit, so be aware of that. Oxalic acid vaporization can be done again around Christmas time is when I do it. And also at this point, you can start working on repairing equipment. getting things ready for next year, putting frames together, boxes together, and more reading in bee schools and so forth. Okay, so now this takes me to my section when I talk about um, when beekeeping begins in earnest, and that is in the month of August. And the reason it does is because you want to deal with this pest. This is probably one of the most important things I could discuss with you at this point is you've got to deal with this mite, varroa destructor virus. It is devastating. And this is the number one reason colonies are lost is because this little mite, if you don't deal with it and keep them killed out of your hive as best as you possibly can, in low numbers, they will spread viruses to your bees and your bees will die. Number one colony loss in the country, and it causes parasitic mite syndrome, and that has to do with viral load in the bees. Um, a nasty creature. Um, there's one virus in particular. This is what happens. Parasitic mite syndrome. This is what happens. What it looks like whenever they devastate. We saw this earlier in the presentation. So one virus called the deformed wing virus A can produce this outcome. It actually causes damage to the wings in the developing bee. When the bee emerges, her wings are crinkled, and she basically can't fly, and she's not going to make it much longer. She's going to die. That's devastating. The deformed wing virus B, which actually is even worse than the deformed wing virus A, which basically at this point in time has taken over. It's what we see more than anything else is a deformed wing virus B at this point in bees when they're tested. It causes shortened abdomens in bees. Um, it actually reduces their ability to make brood food to feed the young bees, which then, of course, damages the whole colony. And also, it actually causes them to have learning deficits. They don't seem to be able to um, do their task properly. It totally disorganizes the entire colony, and the colony begins collapsing. And that's why it's so important to deal with these mites earlier in the season. In August is the best time to do it. Um, you want to do it. Check. You'll recommend checking 4 times a year by the. So check it. It's recommended checking 4 times a year for mites, and it's important that you at least deal with this in August, early August, late July, to get rid of the mites as quickly as you possibly can after the honey supers come off, especially. But just treat the mites. You know, testing for mites is the best way to test is the alcohol wash, um, and there's different types of bottles you can make yourself. Or the easiest thing to do is purchase one of these Easy Check. It's about $20 roughly, and they'll last you forever. You know, they don't go bad, and if they do, it's probably because they get damaged somehow. But generally, it should not go bad. And but what you do basically with the Easy Check is you'll actually will fill up this container that has a basket inside of it uh, to the bottom of that label with rubbing alcohol, usually 70%, or maybe diluted down with some water. You could also use windshield washer fluid. People use Dawn dishwashing liquid, but it makes a sudsy, foamy mess. I recommend either rubbing alcohol or maybe some windshield washer fluid with alcohol in it will do the job also. It's probably a lot cheaper than rubbing alcohol. Obviously, rubbing alcohol has gotten expensive. What you do is you go inside the colony and you'll find a frame of open brood um, where there's nurse bees feeding those bees, open brood. You got to make sure that the queen is not on that frame. You do not want to shake your queen off and kill her. That's very important you are aware of that. Um, but I usually use a large tub, like one of those Rubbermaid type tubs or Sterilite type tubs, and I'll just take the frame and shake the bees off into that tub. Just one jolt with the frame, just one jolt. and then the bees will go in. You let all the flying bees fly out, and they'll go back to the hive. Any nurse bees, which is what you're after at this point to test them, that's where the mites are going to be on, mostly nurse bees. Then after you do this, you'll let the bees fly off, except the nurse bees are still in there. And then you just kind of take the tub and kind of put it on this corner and do a jolt. They'll all go to one corner. Get you a measuring a half cup measuring device, some sort. Either mark a cup with half where half a cup is, or you can just get a measuring device and scoop up a half a cup of bees and pour it into this little basket of the Easy Check, and then close the lid. Put the remaining bees back in the colony and the frame back in the colony. And then at this point, you close the lid off real good and tight. Of course, you closed the lid already. And then screw it on, make sure it's screwed securely, and then shake it real hard, and you'll kill the bees that are in there. Then you take the lid off, fill up the remaining alcohol to above, right where the top of the label is, right there, top of the label is. And then you, at this point, cap it back off, make sure it's secured and not cross-threaded, good and tight, and then shake it for several minutes. Really, really pulverize these bees. Just shake it hard as you can for several minutes, at least 2 or 3 minutes, and good shaking. And then I'll take the whole container, I'll swirl it around and around and around like this, and swirl it, and then I'll let it settle down and count the mites in there. And I may go back and shake some more and swirl it some more, and try to get as many mites off as I can, and I count the mites. And of course, if you have, just one three bees, and it's a half a cup of bees is 300 bees on the average. So if you have three mites, and that's one mite per 100 bee, that's 1% infestation rate. Okay, so you want to have 1% or less, in my opinion. They say 2% or less, but I like 1% or less. So I don't want to see three mites. If I see 1% mites, I'm going to go ahead and treat the colony anyway. So the sugar shake method, people use that because they think that they don't want to kill bees, and so they sugar shake. But you have to pulverize those bees so hard. But shaking it with sugar, you're probably going to kill them anyway. You just don't know they're dead. They're dying inside internally because you shake their internal organs really hard, and they probably aren't going to make it in the first place. You have to shake it so hard to get the mice to come off. It's been shown that the alcohol wash is much more accurate, so that's what I do recommend using. You're using the 300 bees, sacrifice 300 bees to save a colony. Keep in mind the queen's laying on the average that time of year about 1,000 eggs a day. So just think about that. That's not many bees compared to what's in there. You're going to have 1,000 bees emerge that day that you kill 300 bees. It's not a big deal. On the average, they lose about 1,000 bees a day of natural attrition. So keep it in mind that as they all just die of old age, 1,000 bees a day on the average. So killing 300 is not a big deal. This is a Honeybee Health Coalition threshold, dormant brood less than 1%. I like 1% for all times of the year myself. Just keep in mind if it's if population's on the decrease, like would be that time of year, August. I certainly would like to see 1% or less, not 2%, in my opinion. Honeybee Health Coalition website's free. They have a more updated now Varroa management decision tool you can use. It takes you through a series of prompts that tells you what you can use and when you can use it. And there are also videos available too to show you how to use those various products. It's a good site to use. So keep that in mind. Okay, so don't forget that time of year. Like in the probably early September, mid September, early August. I would go in and put my mouse guard on at that point. Let's just basically a half-inch hardware cloth. And then, of course, in late August and early September is when the goldenrod begins blooming. And we like to get this. That's when you'll see the dearth is becoming over. We're getting into the blooming of the asters and the goldenrods and so forth. And pollen's going to be coming in real heavy at this point, and you can smell the pollen that when the goldenrod's blooming, in asters especially, comes back in, and the bees are bringing all this back to the hive. you're going to get this odor out there that's going to smell like what people call dirty sock smell, and it's basically just an odor of this nectar and pollen coming in. And I personally don't mind the odor of it myself. It's really a unique odor, but it tells me there's protein coming in. So I like the odor myself because my bees are getting some fresh pollen coming in. It's very important. And sometimes the goldenrod can make a good source of nectar. But if we've had a dearth or a drought like we had in 2022 here this year, not much nectar at all coming in. But some pollen came in early in the season, but things got dried out really quick and messed things up. So it wasn't necessarily a good year for that. Nothing much in the flow as far as the fall flow this year whatsoever. Um, so in those colonies then that are light, in other words, you have them when pick up the back of the colony to see how heavy they are. If they're light, you probably should go ahead and feed. I like to feed the 1-to-1 sugar syrup. I do this with my nucleus colonies, especially if I'm trying to get them stronger, get them more food in there for the season. Especially if I have queens I've raised and I'm still trying to build up those little nucleus colonies and double stack them up. Then I'm going to feed them 1-to-1 sugar syrup internally, and I use the Borman feeders and then put a box over top of them, two at a time, 2 quarts at a time, essentially. And I'll do this until the goldenrod begins fading. And once the goldenrod begins fading, at that point, I will start early October, late September, early October. I may switch my feeding to 2-to-1. Um, but it's important though to feed these bees. They have good something coming in, a source coming in, even a trickle feed. But to get weight on those hives and get the queen to lay as many bees as possible, because you want a good cluster going into wintertime. A lot of winter bees. It's important to have a lot of winter bees available. Two reasons: one, they have to get through wintertime to be able to raise spring bees, and the second reason is the more bees you have, the bigger cluster you're going to have, and they can produce more heat to keep that cluster warm during the wintertime. Um, so the winter bees do have a different physiology, like we discussed earlier. Their fat bodies are basically store of vitellogenin, which is a glycolipoprotein. It's got properties of glycogen, which is a sugar substance, fats and lipids, and then protein also. All three things are in there. And this is a reserve to get them through the wintertime and gives the winter bees the ability to feed larvae when the queen begins laying, especially at the winter solstice and into early spring. Then I'll switch to 2-to-1 sugar syrup. If I need to put extra weight on quickly, I will feed them 2 parts sugar, 1 part water. The way I make this up is I either make it in large batches or smaller amounts on top of my stove. And you want 6 quarts of water and 25 pounds of sugar. You want to actually bring the water to a boil and then add the sugar in parts until you melt it down. Stir it in real well. Don't boil the water. Once the sugar is in there, don't boil it. You don't want to boil the sugar, get it too hot at this point. Just it's basically enough to melt the sugar and then let it cool down, of course. If I make a small batches, I use the gallon jugs that Arizona Tea comes in. They make excellent. That's a very good, high quality, good plastic to use to transport the sugar syrup out to the apiary. Arizona Tea is a gallon jugs are excellent for this. Very strong plastic and can utilize them over and over again. So 6 quarts of water and 25 pounds of sugar. Again, you want to feed the bees like we discussed earlier. Same difference. Make sure they have plenty of stores. Boardman feeders on the inside, high top feeders, the frame feeders, just like this. And then also too, usually early October, I will try to catch 2 weekends back to back, maybe late September, that's warm, like in the 60s. I want some warm temperatures in the 60s and 70s even. And I want to feed my bees 2-to-1 sugar syrup. And I do open feeding. Open feeding can be done as long as you have the ability to place your open feeding containers away from your main apiary, at least preferably 300 feet or 100 yards away is recommended. So get away from 100 yards away, which is 300 feet away from your apiary if you possibly can do that. If not, you should have some kind of barrier between those containers, like a house or a bunch of trees. The reason you want to do this because that if and bees find these sources, they'll tell the other bees where they're located, and by doing the waggle dance or round dance. And if they're too close, then they'll tell the bees, "Hey, this food is close by." They may end up going to beehives that are weaker, close to your apiary, your own apiary, and begin robbing those out. So you want to have these away from your hive as best as you possibly can. Um, so this way, they won't sense that hey, this is close by. It's a little bit farther out, and maybe do a waggle dance instead. And the waggle dance then can tell them, hey, this is over 300 yards away or 300 feet away rather, away from your apiary. So keep that in mind. If you have a barrier like a house, they have to fly around and go over. That really helps also to make the position. Now these are kind of placed, past some trees, and then there's a tree behind them like this. They have to come around. So it really doesn't. I don't see robbing, to any great extent whatsoever when I do this. People say, well, it causes robbing. It doesn't really cause robbing as much as you think, but just get it away from your apiary close as best you can when you're feeding like this, if possible. Otherwise, you should feed internally in your colonies. But generally, what I'll do is I'll take 6 quarts of water, and I have an oven in my garage, and I boil the water till it comes to, heat the water till it comes to boiling. And then I have the 25 pounds of sugar in the bucket already, sitting in my garage, outside of my garage area. Um, and then I just pour the hot water in there, and I take a large, long paint stirring metal paint stirrer, hook it to my drill, and I will use that to mix up this sugar syrup pretty quickly, and then get them all done at one time. So there's basically 10 buckets with it makes about 4 gallons each. There's 2-to-1 sugar syrup. Again, 6 quarts of water, 25 pounds of sugar. Then I take some straw or hay, and I put it down inside of each bucket. Um, so that way, it pushes the hay down inside there. This keeps the bees from drowning. You want to push the hay down into the sugar syrup. It'll kind of float back to the top again. Those 2 sticks or quarter rounds are stuck down inside all the way to the bottom of the bucket, and the lids are closed around them. This gives the ability for the bees to crawl back out when they get full, and they'll feed on this, and they'll actually consume these 40 gallons total in about a day and a half to 2 days. It'll be gone. And I do this, usually try to do it back to back weekends. In addition to feeding other colonies that are weaker, that have not many stores, I still feed them internally also simultaneously. In our area, we need about 40 to 60 pounds of food per colony to get them through wintertime. That's the storage you should have. Generally, it's been said that you want to feed each beehive about 4 gallons of 2-to-1 sugar syrup in order to get this kind of weight back on them. That's what is recommended. So each full 10 frame deep weighs about 80 to 90 pounds because one deep frame weighs about 8 pounds. So it'd be about 80 to 90 pounds of honey in there. In this case, sugar syrup honey. That's not used for honey. It's strictly for the bees. No, you don't use this for honey whatsoever. You don't ever put sugar syrup out for bees to eat when you have the honey supers on. That's not honey, that's sugar syrup. It's not the same thing. Honey comes from nectar, from trees and flowers, and this is sugar syrup. So it's not to be used for food, for human consumption. Winter feeding. What I do with winter feeding is once the cold weather comes on in, I'll begin then reconfiguring my colonies or hives with a shim and a quilt box is what I use. You don't have to use a quilt box. I choose to do that, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. But I do make sugar cake, and the way that I make sugar cake is there's different ways you can feed bees. Sugar cake, hard sugar candy, fondant, various ways you can do this. But the way I do it is I take the sugar cake, I take 10 pounds of sugar and about 15 ounces of water, and about 1 ounce of either Honeybee Healthy or Pro Health, whichever one's available. And what I'll do is I'll take the on the stove in the kitchen or down in the garage. I will bring that 15 ounces of water to boil, and I'll add in about 5 pounds of sugar and mix it up real good until it makes a good slurry. I'll add in my Honeybee Healthy 1 ounce of that, or Pro Health, into that. That way it kind of gets really dispersed well into the mixture, and then add the remaining 5 pounds of sugar in two increments roughly, and stir it up until it's going to be really dry, just barely wet. Actually, just mix it, make sure it's good and wet. It's you don't want to get it. That's all you want to add. It's going to be hard to move it with a spoon. Your spoon needs to be a good high quality spoon that won't break on you. I know Pamper Chef makes a real strong hard plastic spoon. Other our plastic spoons will break on you because its stuff is real thick. Once you get it mixed up, you scoop. You basically I use a 9-inch heavy duty pie pan, which I bought. And I use them over and over again every year. Just a heavy duty. You can buy those at Kroger's or any place like that. But they can last for years. Take parchment paper. This makes it easy to get the sugar cake out when you get it in there. Parchment paper, pull off enough to cover the bottom of this thing. The edges out is fine. I trim the edges a little bit, and then I'll just dump in the sugar cake once this sugar mixture, once it's wetted down well, like the recipe calls for. Dump it in there and make it about 3/4 of an inch thick, roughly. And then at that point, I'll bake this in about 50 minutes in the oven at about 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and then let it cool overnight, of course, and let it set for about 2 to 3 days afterwards. 2 days roughly. It'll harden real hard, and then that way you can, at this point, pull it out of the pie pans and use them again. So this hardens well. Now you don't have to bake it, but if you do it like this, you're going to have to let it set for at least a week to 10 days to dry out completely, to become really hard. Otherwise, it will tend to crumble in your hands. So you try to put it in the hive. Just be aware of that. Um, that's what they look like right here when they're finished. Little sugar cake, and as they are placed inside the hive, I remove my inner cover, and I place this shim, which is a 1x2 shim I make that goes on here, and I use a quilt box on top of this. I'm going to show you that in a minute here. The quilt box goes on top of that, and then of course I remove the inner cover completely. They're stored away in the garage, and then of course the top cover goes on the quilt box. The bees will prefer the sugar cake over honey, so they'll come up and get the sugar cake over the honey. Another way you can feed them is using a candy board like this. This is basically a candy board. Is another box you can make. It looks like a half-inch hardboard cloth, or probably can use 1/8 inch hardboard. I say a 1/4 inch hardboard cloth actually can work. And just put your sugar cake in there, pound it down, leave an entrance so they can come up, and that goes on top of the frames, and they come up and just eat that cake, and from the bottom of it, that's fine too. Fondant can be laid directly on the top of the frames. This is a recipe here. I'm not going to go over this. You can take a picture if you need to. Fondant can be difficult to make. There are YouTube videos you can watch to how to make this. You can also purchase fondant too from various supply houses. Hard sugar blocks, a little bit more difficult to make. You have to deal with uh, very hot sugar syrup. But people do make this and make it hard, very hard candy. Um, Kevin Hill's recipe is what this is from. Kevin Hill's, a beekeeper in Eastern Kentucky. That's a shim. It's a 1x2. Well, those are the dimensions of the 15.5 inches by 19 1/8 inches of the shim. The quilt box is made with a 1x4. We use number 8 hardboard cloth to make a basket on the inside. And there are actually little strips that go inside across the bottom of the quilt box to keep the screen from sagging down. You don't want the screen sagging down. That's something I do make those myself. I don't sell them, but I make them myself for myself. You can purchase quilt boxes though from online or make your own. You don't have to use these, but this is for moisture control. What people can also do is to help with moisture control wintertime. Your shims on there with your sugar cake, and then you can take put the inner cover back on top of the shim, and then you can use just some 1 inch insulation board, cut it to fit inside the top cover, and basically at that point you would lay some popsicle sticks around the edges, just a couple, on each side of the inner cover, and put the top cover on top of that. And this allows some ventilation, the moisture to come out of there, which is important, and allows for ventilation. So you can do it that way. You can also just remove the inner cover completely and do the same thing. Put the little popsicle sticks on top of the shim, and then set the top cover on top of that. It's going to provide ventilation. Keep in mind the bees are inside the colony, the good sized cluster that's healthy. They don't heat the whole entire hive; they just heat the cluster. And but that's important to know. They heat the cluster to stay warm, keep the queen warm and the brood warm. These are some instruments, oxalic acid vaporization devices, and I have one on the top I've used in the past. It's made by Kelly's, which is now Man Lake, but it has actually a timer built into it. I like it pretty well. It works well for me. Others are good too. One on the right is actually a very low profile. It's a good one to use, but you got to time it just right. You got to time. There's a way to do this, and timing it with a stopwatch. This is a Pro Vape 110, and it's a very, very good instrument to use. It rapidly delivers the oxalic acid vapor. You got to make sure to use protective equipment when you do use these products. Go by the instructions. Goggles as well as respirators. Very important to do that. This device here is very quick and enables me to treat my hives very quickly. Probably saves me probably at least half or maybe 3/4 of the time it normally takes me to do them with the wand. Okay, after the winter solstice, the brood nest starts expanding. Then we got to deal with late winter feeding and early spring feeding. In the spring, like early spring or late winter, at the end of February, early part of March, I will then add my winter patties. This is recipe from Kevin Hill. And sugar, it's mostly sugar. It's 3 cups of Ultra B protein. I like it best as opposed to AP23, which I've also used too. It's okay also. But 3 cups of Ultra B protein, 9 cups of sugar. You want to add enough 1-to-1 sugar syrup or 2-to-1 sugar syrup to make the consistency of peanut butter and form into a large rectangular shaped patty on wax paper. I generally take the wax paper on a couple of thin plastic cutting board sheets. You do not want to cut your countertop because you will with this. But you just lay down a layer of the wax paper, and then once you get the mixture made out, you just dump it on there and kind of just form it into approximately, I would say, 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch thickness patty, and then cover it with another layer of wax paper and flatten it out, get it all evened out. And then you want to cut it into little squares, and the squares can be then removed and placed inside the hives. I do remove at least one part of the wax paper, the top or bottom, usually the top, and lay it inside next to my sugar cake. If you want to store these in the refrigerator, you should do that, and then warm them back up when you get them out to use them. But I recommend using this freezer bags or just Ziploc bags, gallon size, and make a layer, just maybe one layer in each bag, because if you put these into a bag in several layers, they tend to gum together, and it's hard to separate them to get them into the colony. Just better to use more bags and make one layer each. Just makes it much easier to deal with. And this is what they look like when they go inside the colony. This provides a little extra protein late because now they're really brooding up, and so they need extra protein to stabilize them until the maples start blooming real well. Once the maples begin blooming well, you don't have to do this. They're bringing plenty of pollen. Maples and hembat and dead nettle coming in, pussy willow, various other things are bringing in, even dandelion eventually. So the brood nest is expanding. There are two main goals, and that is one is survival of the colony, the species. Keep in mind it's a superorganism, so its survival of the colony is important. And the second is number two goal is survival of the species by reproduction. And the way bees, of course, bees reproduce individually, and the queen lays eggs and produces more bees. But as a superorganism, the way that superorganism reproduces, it does it by swarming. So that swarms are basically baby bee colonies. These are new bee colonies. However, interesting enough, the old queen usually goes out with the new colony, and the younger queens stay inside the colony. So even though it's a new bee colony coming out, it's the old queens with them typically. So some swarming is a natural process that bees reproduce, and it's a natural urge for them to do this. They do everything in their power. What they do to get all the honey stores and build up this bee numbers of bees is not for us to get honey. It's for them to reproduce and survive as a species. But some swarming triggers are lots of resources coming into the hive. Like in other words, there's a heavy honey flow coming on, lots of pollen coming in, and the large number of bees are there. There is limited space and congestion in the brood nests. And when this happens, basically, the queen has no place to lay anymore. Supposedly, they will run her around and get her smaller, but they also stop feeding her as much. And she will stop laying as much. She begins shutting down essentially because there's no place to lay. And because of this, they will begin backfilling the brood nests with nectar. So in areas that she normally would lay into, they put nectar in those spots. And that's one of the things you'll see early on in pre-swarming preparation is backfilling the brood nest. I'll show you a picture shortly of that. Also too, because there are so many bees in the colony now, just lots and lots of bees, thousands and thousands of extra bees in there, the pheromone from the queen, which they pass to each other, is being diluted because there's more and more bees. And so the pheromones get back to her eventually. She knows that her pheromones levels are dropping. And so it's a trigger for her at this point to begin trying to find a place to lay eggs, I'm sure, into queen cells. Because she has to choose to lay those eggs in those queen cells. And when she does, obviously, they become queens. That's another thing. Some negative feedback has a bearing on this, too. The colony itself, the workers, are the ones who determine if it's time to swarm or not. Because they begin making the queen cells for her to lay in. She doesn't do that herself, obviously. Some swarm prevention techniques preemptively. Young queens from a year before, like queens that are raised and mated after the first day of summer the previous year, are less likely to swarm. And then going to be talking about reversing hive bodies. We'll discuss that shortly. Be careful not to separate the brood nests. Adding honey supers with drawn comb will reduce but not eliminate swarming. It does help. And of course, you can do splits, making up nuke splits with queen cells, equalizing colonies. And what that means is you can take a strong colony, remove brood and frames of bees and brood, put into a weaker colony to equalize them. This helps the smaller colonies to become more apt to collect honey and nectar, make honey, and the stronger colonies to kind of take them down a notch or two, so that way they're less likely to swarm. That's one thing you can do. It doesn't stop it; it just helps relieve the pressure. And then making the artificial swarm by removing the queen and several frames of bees and cap brood. The original colony needs eggs to make a new queen. So we're going to talk about the brood nest being in between the hive bodies. In this configuration, you do not want to obviously do a reversal, but here you would, because the brood nest is in the top of the hive body. And what you'll see is the bottom box will be completely empty, just drawn comb only. If that's the case, you want to actually reverse these hive bodies. You put the top box on the bottom and the bottom box on the top. This will give her places upstairs to lay. Now, some people at this point they will take those middle frames and scratch um, those capped areas of honey open with a capping scratcher. This will help them remove that honey and move it upstairs out of that area, because the queen oftentimes will not cross over capped honey. So if you scratch a few areas, in those middle frames especially, scratch them with a capping scratcher to open up the comb, the honeycomb that's capped over in that section. This will help her move up quicker into the top box. The bottom configuration, where the brood nest is already in the bottom or maybe hasn't come up all the way yet, you do not want to reverse this at this point, because if you do, you're going to separate the two areas of brood, and you may have chill brood because they can't stay warm, because some of the bees will stay with the top brood, some bees will stay with the bottom brood, and so you're going to have less bees available to keep the whole area warm, and so don't do that. If they've already moved down already and started to lay in the bottom, if you don't catch them quick enough, don't reverse those either. So depending on the strength of the colony, and if you're seeing whiting, of course, you may want to add a honey super. And this is whiting here. You can see where the old comb is there, and they put this new comb down. It's white. And the whiting is basically brand new comb. And it's coming in because there's a nectar flow coming on. So at this point, you probably will go ahead at that point and you want to add a honey super. This shows a colony with a whole lot of bees. Here's a picture now of backfilling of the brood nest. You can see where all the areas where the queen would be normally laying and producing brood in here, they filled up with nectar. The queen has no place to lay, and so this is a trigger here for her for them to start swarm preparation. Obviously, at this point, here you can see they've had built queen cells, and the queen's laid in there. Generally, what happens is when the swarm occurs, whenever those cells are capped over, that's when the old queen will leave with about half the bees. That would be a swarm. But you want to try to prevent that from happening, because if your bees swarm out and you don't catch them, you've lost those bees. And also, too, those bees take honey with them, and because you lose bees, that colony is not going to produce as much honey for you this time of the year. So it's important you try to prevent swarming from occurring. You can decrease the swarming impulse by you removing and making a nuke split, for example, is one way of doing it. You take the old queen out in a couple of frames of cap brood and open brood, making sure there are no queen cells. Shake some bees off in here, and add a couple of frames, even a foundation on the ends, on the sides. And so you can even add a second box if you have to. This will be a nucleus colony split. This will make them think they've swarmed already. You should leave behind, if you have queen cells already present in there that are not capped over yet. Obviously, the queen hasn't left yet. Go ahead and keep the 2 or 3 best ones in there in the parent hive, and cut out the rest of them. It's my opinion to do that. So this will help reduce the chances of doing after swarms, which is where actually, because the colony is so strong, virgin queens will leave with some of the bees and make the little virgin swarm. So you don't want that happening if you can help it. So I would cut out every single swarm cell that you find in there, except for maybe 2 or 3 of the best ones in there. A walk-away split, it's just like it is. You actually can even out the resources and pull the colony apart, go through the colony. If you find the queen, great. If you don't, it's great too. But just be careful not to roll her and kill her. My recommendation is to take this 2 colonies here and then separate everything out even them out completely, um, and then separate them completely. You can move one colony away from the whole area 2 miles away, or you can leave it in the same apiary. It's up to you entirely how you want to do that. This is called a walk-away split. The one colony has a queen, will go on, and they will produce a new queen if there's a resource available. There should be eggs and larvae available, so they can go ahead and produce a new queen. Um, Sometimes the foreign bees will come back to the spot with the hive that's left in the original location. But what you can do if that happens is go ahead and bring back the other box in the same location, take the one to the other spot, and this will kind of even out the number of bees coming back, foraging bees coming back. So you can do that. It's called walk away split. And later on down the line, you can, as they fill things out, you can go ahead and add a second box to each of these if you can. Super ring or top super ring versus bottom super ring. If you've already put a super honey super on there, you want to do what's called checkerboarding, and that means basically you will pull out 5 frames of the capped honey if it's capped already, and then basically do a frame of capped honey, and then a frame of foundation or drawn comb, and then capped honey, drawn comb, capped honey, drawn comb in both boxes, and that's called checkerboarding. That's what I call it, a type of checkerboarding. This will help them draw out the comb if it's a foundation. This also helps relieve congestion also simultaneously. Gives them something to do, and you put foundation in there too. They'll draw it out evenly between the drawn out pieces of comb that you have there with the capped honey. Um, but if you add a third box, I recommend just putting that on the bottom with just either drawn comb or possibly foundation. Um, that can go on, to the below the two if they're getting full already. So keep that in mind. And then now we're going to talk about some swarm control methods. There's different things you can do: Day-Marie, Pageant, and Snellgrove. We're going to just discuss briefly the Snellgrove method using a double screen board. And the other two you can read about and research as you become more familiar with the beekeeping different methods. So, swarm prevention, traditional versus non-traditional Snellgrove or double screen method. Um, the Snellgrove board is basically not the same as a double screen. The Snellgrove board generally has just one screen, but people call it Snellgrove, but it's really just a double screen method. And this is a double screen here. It basically has a screen on top, screen on bottom, separated by wood and a space. And it has little gates, 4 or 3 on top and 3 or 4 on the bottom section. And a very unique piece of equipment, but it's actually underutilized in this country. But it does great, in my opinion. And a lot of master beekeepers use them to put in their colonies to get a better honey crop. And here's how it works. This is somewhat complicated, but just read this. Um, so this is a Snellgrove board or double screen method of swarm control when queen cells are found in a double stack. You can also do this when queen cells are not found as a preemptive measure, the when they're about to swarm, because they will make queen cells, obviously, emergency queen cells. However, it's best to do that when they have queen cells, if you can, made already or being made already, because queens coming from queen cells are much, much better than those emergency produced. Those swarm queen cells always make the best queens, period, um, in most cases. So you want to get 2 extra empty deep boxes. And then what you do is you go to the hive. This usually try to do this in the spring of the year. What's the strongest hive that you have, and or hives? Work with them, the strong ones first, because they're going to be the ones typically they're going to swarm first. So try to get them done first if you have time constraints, and I do. But you go through each frame, separating them, and find the queen. You want to place the queen in a secure location, preferably maybe in another box somewhere, like in one of the corrugated plastic nuke boxes. Set her aside somewhere in the shade to keep her from getting damaged or hurt. you want to separate the cat brood from all the other frames and place the frames in one of the empty boxes. In other words, you put all your cat brood in one box and all the other frames in another box. Okay, you want to find a frame with 2 or 3 good queen cells and place it in the bottom deep. Remove all other queen cells from all the other frames, which means you have to shake the bees off each frame to do this correctly. They can hide these queen cells in various locations and nooks and crannies. It's very important that you shake these off and find every single queen cell that's there except for the 2 or 3 that you want to save. You want to fill the bottom box with remaining frames with honey and open cells, that is, open brood cells or honey. Then you want to place 2 supers, preferably with drawn comb, on the top of the bottom box, without a queen excluder, in my opinion. If you already had a super on there, then checkerboard with another super, and maybe even add a 3rd super if need be. A 3rd super could be needed. Place the snail grove board, or double screen board in this case, on top of the supers, and then place the other deep box on top of a snail grove board. Shake off every single bee and remove all the queen cells of every one of those frames of cat brood. This is the cat brood. Place all the frames of cat brood in the top box. Shake them off, the bees off in the top box. Put the queen into the box. Gently pick her up by her wings, or just grab her by her thorax gently and put her into the top box. And then I will shake off those bees off of that frame into the top box and make sure there are no queen cells on the frame she just came off of. All right. At that point, you put the inner cover on, and then top cover goes on that. Most of the foragers will return to the main entrance in front if they come out of that top box, because you've opened the back door of the double screen board. They will fly out eventually, or even then. The foragers, because they're used to being outside and foraging, they will fly out of that door and go out and do their thing foraging. And by the way, I like to do this in the middle of the day when a lot of the bees are out already foraging. It makes it a lot easier to do this. Just do it while the bees are out foraging. You'll have less bees to work with there. But they're going to come back. The bees that are foraging, and any bees that fly out of the top box are going to come back, and they're going to fly into the main entrance of the bottom of that hive, because that's their home. That's where they've been used to coming in and out of. So they're going to go back there. But any nurse bees that have not come out before and are foragers yet are going to stay with the brood in the top box where the queen is. The old queen's up there. So you're given the basic impression that the queen has left and split this colony, and all the foragers now are going to go back. She just has nurse bees. And so any bees now that are there already, the nurse bees, will finally graduate to become foragers. And also the other bees are going to be emerging. They're going to be nurse bees. So the foraging bees are going to go back to the original entrance. And then as these bees nurse bees become graduating into foraging bees, their new home is upstairs in the top box. And they're going to be coming in and out of that top entrance in the back of the hive. That's what they learn. They're going to go out and fly and orient themselves to that opening, and they're going to start using that. So after about 21 to 30 days of this happening, you're going to see a lot of traffic going in and out of that top box. Okay, at that point, what I do is I will close the top entrance door, close it off completely, and open the door right below that door, which then communicates with the bottom of the hive. In other words, it communicates with the supers below in the bottom box completely. So they're going to come back and try to get back in the opening to the top hive, which is where their home is, but they can't get in. So they're going to go downstairs. This is going to increase the population of foraging bees to be able to bring back the nectar to produce honey in those supers that are below the snail grove board. Okay, simultaneously you want to go ahead and open one of the side top doors so the bees can get out of the top box on the side. This is where basically you got the splits here. How I'm splitting the colonies. This is what you got to do to get everything arranged as you work with them. Okay, so and you may actually after another 21 days or so go ahead and close the top door on the side, open the door right below it, and so that way the foraging bees will go in the bottom box on that side, and you open up the other side, opposite side, top door, so the top bees can get out of that door. Then, so you continue to make the upper box is going to be like a bee factory, essentially making new bees to produce honey for the bottom supers. And this is the way you do it. You'll have literally humongous colony of bees, 60,000 bees in the bottom eventually, going to produce a lot of nectar. This is all done right before at the time of the honey flow, so you can have the best possible crop you can have. You have to add more honey supers, possibly to the bottom. All right. After the honey harvest is finished and everything is fading away, we're getting out of the main honey flow. There are several options you can do now at this point. The first option is to remove the top box and place on a bottom board and have a colony increase. Okay, colony increase. So this is another beehive with the old queen. A second option is to sell, give away, or pinch the old queen and then combine the top box with the bottom box. And so you requeen. Now, I also, one thing I forgot to say was after 30 days, I do disassemble this thing and go in the bottom box and make sure that the queen has emerged from those queen cells, now has come back and mated and come back. If she hasn't, and there's no queen in the bottom, then you need to go ahead and recombine the colony right then. Recombine the colony at that point. But if she has, you can use her then to requeen that colony as a brand new queen for the year, a good mated queen. Okay, that's one option. So the third option is to make a nucleus colony with the old queen, which is in top, as a backup, and then recombine the colony back together again. That's how you do it. Now, this section talks about the snail grove board method or double screen board when queen cells are found in a single box colony, not a double stack, but a single box colony that you only have one box. You have a configuration of one single box in the bottom, not a double stack. And the same way you want to obtain empty boxes, you want to obtain empty brood box of frames of drawn comb or foundation. Has some extra boxes available to manipulate. All right, you want to find the frame that the queen is on and place in the bottom box. In the bottom box, okay, everything is out of the bottom. You find the queen, take it apart, take everything out of the bottom, remove the bottom box off the bottom board completely. You find the queen, frame the queen is on, put her in the bottom box, okay, that she's on that frame, and then maybe go ahead and add a frame of pollen and honey beside her in the bottom box. You got to make sure there are no queen cells whatsoever on that frame that she's on, and also the one you're putting in there with the honey and pollen. No queen cells whatsoever. Okay. Fill the remaining box with drawn comb or foundation if you don't have drawn comb, and then place the honey supers on top of the bottom box. And then the snail grove board goes on top of the honey supers. Then you place a deep box on top of the snail grove board and add original frames, replacing the two frames of the foundation that you took out where the queen is down there. Remove all the queen cells except for 2 or 3 of the best ones. And you can manipulate these doors every 4 to 5 days, or just open the back top door and manipulate the doors after the new queen is laying in the top box in about 30 days. Depends on how you want to do that. This is what it looks like. You have a deep box. This particular configuration has a deep box, and this one has the new queen in the bottom. I have already added a queen excluder, which I don't do that actually until July, around June 15th. I make sure I made a mistake of actually adding that last year too early. But I don't recommend adding this back until at least around June 15th, maybe a little bit later even. But this will give time for any brood that's up in here to emerge. This actually, probably should have had a queen excluder early on, but I had these two boxes already full of nectar and honey. This third box was added at the bottom here because it has what's called section comb honey, which is like special little section comb honey, a different type of comb honey. It's comb honey. So and it's sold like as in little squares essentially, or you can use it for the Ross rounds and so forth. They made that out pretty good. It's a pretty good deal there. These two supers here are just a drawn comb. You can also use thin foundation, medium-sized thin foundation, and medium boxes to make cut comb honey. That's good to have. Then of course, then you have your Snell Grove or double screen board here, and then the second boxes, brood boxes on top with the old queen in that. Okay. When it comes time, recommending now over in England especially they use a Snell Grove board. It only has a single screen as opposed to double screen. The single screen the whole time, the two queens and one on top, one on bottom are communicating with their pheromones essentially. So you can just basically take this the Snell Grove board out and just combine it back together again without using newspaper whatsoever. If you have a double screen board, I recommend newspaper. Basically, you get rid of the old queen if you want to, and whichever way you want to do that, and then put newspaper between that. Take the Snell Grove board out and make two layers of newspaper. One layer of newspaper is fine too in this case, and make little slits in there, little bit slits in the newspaper um, between frames, and just combine them. By the time that the bees chew through this paper, the pheromones that spread from the bottom queen to the top queen to the top bees. That is, so combining with newspapers. This is shim with a hole in it here. Sometimes I use that to as an entrance point. Not always. A lot of times you just close it up and do the recombine. They'll figure it out. They'll find the entrance eventually. So the next thing I'm talking about here is storage of your drawn honeycomb. Um, I generally do use peridochlorobenzene, which is also called paramoth or moth ice crystals. It's been used for eons of time, and I use treatment drawers here and here, five or six supers, and then a treatment drawer. I tape this whole thing up with painter's tape. I add in the paramoth on newspaper inside the treatment drawers, just to fumigate to keep wax moths from damaging my comb. I generally have about 45 supers right now that's stacked up in my garage this time of year, being preserved to keep the wax moths from laying eggs and producing wax moth larvae, which will just decimate your comb. They particularly like comb that's had brood in it. They don't usually mess with comb, just with honeycomb only. But some of my comb does have some brood, has had brood in it before, and they'll go after that for sure, and they'll destroy it. Um, but come spring of the year, you have to take all this apart and set those boxes catty cornered to each other in a good ventilated area. Let it air out for about 4 weeks and get all the smell out. This paramoth or padrochlorobenzene is a fumigant, and it just basically evaporates and it kind of just gets out of the air and gets out of the boxes completely in the spaces. Another way you can preserve your comb is by freezing it and storing it in a freezer. That's a good way to do it too. I've had people stack up your boxes catty cornered in lights, and yet the wax moths will still get to it sometimes. Keep that in mind. Um, you can use this product called Certain, which is basically a type of bacterial thing. It's actually a bacteria, um, and this bacteria comes from the ground. It's a soil bacteria actually, and they raise it and produce it and make it into a solution, which is spray. You spray all your combs with it. It's not dangerous to people or bees either one, but you spray it on all the combs front and back. And when wax moth larvae eggs hatch, the wax moth larvae eats this some of the bacteria, and the bacteria get inside their guts and it kills them. So it's a larvicide. It kills a biological larvicide. It's actually a good product to use. It's kind of expensive, but it can be used. And but it is somewhat labor intensive. But if you don't want to use powdered corn benzene, that's a product to use right here. Is a certain that's a very good product to use actually. I know that John Benham, my beekeeper, uses it. Um, so here is my little apiary here, and my email address. Again, I am EAS, Eastern Agricultural Society Certified Master Beekeeper. This society association, the largest non-commercial beekeeping association in the country, and they have a meeting somewhere, usually in the eastern part of the United States, every year. And so this coming year, it's going to be in the University of Massachusetts in 2023. Hope to see people there. It's a good conference. It's a 5-day conference. It's intense. It's really, really good stuff. Lots of good speakers, and it's a good time. If you have any questions, just send me an email, davdvm@gmail.com, and if I can't get to you eventually, I will eventually email you back. Thank you for your attention.